It's Saturday morning, March 11th, 2017, in Georgetown, South Carolina. A local resident is plying his hobby of fishing on the Black River. He notices something in the water that doesn't look right to him. And he looks more closely, and he is incredibly alarmed. This is a body floating in the Black River.
Rolling. This is Investigator Alan Morris. How come down here they call it investigator instead of detective?
I guess because we're general investigators. I work everything from, fraud cases, burglaries, bank robberies, pretty much anything and everything. We might get a call out, you just never know. It could be a normal day, but a normal day could turn to a busy day really quick. Really and truly, this job is life. A body was actually discovered in the county jurisdiction, and because of that, the sheriff's office responded for law enforcement to go out there.
I'm on my way.
We got the call about 1:30 that day. When I got there, they were in the process of bringing the body to shore. Law enforcement officers had to actually physically grab hold of the individual by clothing and just ease him back to shore. Was this somebody that had perhaps fallen in the water or out of a boat? You just don't know. But when they brought him to shore, it was immediately evident to me that he had not fallen in the water accidentally. His wrist and his ankles were bound with speaker wire. That, to me, was a clear indication that he had been the victim of homicide.
When your victim is found floating in the water, it enormously complicates the case. Water does terrible things to human bodies. They can't tell the cause of death looking at the remains because they're in such poor condition.
Here, the elements in the south can be tricky, even in February and March. The water plays a factor in the decomposition and the speed.
The face is unrecognizable.
Positive identification was not made at that point, but I was thinking back just because we had already been investigating a missing person. I remember Miss Brittany Green came in to report a missing person.
She says his name is Leon Harrison Jr., but everybody calls him JR, and he is the father of her 2 children. They no longer live together, but he routinely calls her every night to speak to the children. He hasn't called in 2 weeks.
A guy that has family, that has loved ones, that has children, they're not just gonna vanish off this earth.
Brittany explains to police that Mr. Harrison is 32 years old. He is an African-American male, but he has a rose tattooed on his inner right forearm, an identifying tattoo. Now Morris is trying to determine if this body that was found in the river is in fact his missing person. Investigator Morris generally works property crimes. If this is in fact a homicide, it'll be his very first.
The body was sent for autopsy. It was my first autopsy. So yeah, I mean, it was a nerve-wracking thing.
I recall my first autopsy very well. After you've been to several hundred of them, you tend not to pay attention. But the first one is a shock.
That had been the first time that I had actually seen him, because I wasn't there during the retrieval. It was gruesome. He was bounded by hand and foot. That's the most uncivilized way that I could ever see a person going out of this world.
The medical examiner explains to Morris that although he cannot determine the cause of death because of the decomposition level is so great, he can rule it as a homicide based on the bindings. The lacerations to the belly are not deep. They're not enough to cause exsanguination, in other words, bleeding to death. They're not enough to cause internal damage either.
It's hard to say what those were with the condition of the body due to the presence of animals and that sort of thing in the water.
There are also alligators in this river, but they prefer living things. Normally, they like a live target that they can kill and then eat. The medical examiner offers an opinion that perhaps a beating was involved that caused the death, blunt force trauma, but he can't even really say that. He just doesn't know. When your victim has obviously been in the water for an extended period of time, there is no way DNA trace is going to survive or fingerprints survive. So you're not going to find something that identifies somebody responsible for this. The findings of the autopsy were relatively useless, with one major exception. The presence of a rose tattoo on the right arm identifies this body as that of Leon Harrison Jr., also known as JR. The case of missing person is now retitled homicide. There's an expression in homicide. You go from being a new guy to an old guy in about 30 minutes. Morris is nervous, he's worried, he's all the right things. So he begins by inquiring about the victim.
Miss Brittany Green was brought in to give us some information about him and what he was like as a father.
Leon, he was a funny, outgoing person, big personality. Loved to smile, tell jokes, loving, caring father.
My dad was goofy, funny, joyful, and active. We always used to watch Dallas Cowboys. They're a very great dad.
My first day playing football, and I remember running my first touchdown. He was running down the side like, oh, go Quest, go boy, go boy. He met me in the end zone. He was going crazy.
Brittany Green said he always was connected to those two kids, and he called them every night.
He would always come and check on his children.
The investigators talked to Green. Are there any issues? Does he have any enemies? The only thing she says is that he has an estranged wife, and her name is Taish Rue.
I learned of Taish probably like July of 2015. They got married, I believe, September.
She says he'd been married for a while, but they recently broke up, and he moved out.
He used to call me and talk to me about things that was going on in their relationship. He wasn't happy.
So we suddenly appear to have a dead man with recent marital troubles of some kind. That could be interesting. It could mean nothing. We've got to find out. So JR's estranged wife is of great interest to Morris. However, they find some difficulty in locating her. Morris decides to return to Taish Rue later and move on to JR's phone records.
We got any kind of phone records that we can get.
The evening of February 25th, he did have 2 phone calls from a man named Samuel Pillman, who could be the last person to see JR alive. So Morris wants to talk to this guy.
We did go to his job, but he was not there that day.
His boss tells him he lives at the Quality Inn. So Morris goes there thinking he'll reach Pillman. He knocks on the door. No one answers. He calls Pillman's cell phone. Pillman answers the phone. When Morris says who he is, Pillman hangs up. Now that raises an eyebrow. Pillman has just informed Morris he's a potential suspect. Hanging up on a detective ensures that you're about to meet the detective. Well, let's review, Mr. Pillman. Now you get a phone call from a policeman and you don't want to talk to him. What do you have to do with the death of JR? When Morris calls him back, he takes a different approach. He says, look, I'm investigating the death of Leon Harrison Jr., and that's the only reason I want to talk to you. Mr. Pillman, why were you calling him?
He said they were going to meet up. He was going to buy some drugs from Leon Harrison Jr.
Well, my roommate and I wanted to celebrate a birthday, and so we thought we'd get a little high, and JR could help us out. JR's got this side hustle. He sells a little bit of grass now and again.
And truly, to me, it didn't matter, regardless of what his situation was. He was still murdered, and it didn't really matter whether he was a drug dealer or not.
So Pillman says also that the first call he made with JR said, all right, I'll come by your room and we'll make the deal there. But then he never shows up. So he calls him back. Only this time there's no answer. Is Pillman lying? Did JR show up at the Quality Inn and Pillman overcame him, robbed him of his drugs and his money, and then killed him?
When we were looking at his phone, so we got to analyze the data.
His conversation jives with the phone records because the second call Pillman made only lasted like 15, 20 seconds because there's no answer, like he said. So Pillman is dropped as a suspect.
Everything was a challenge. I mean, because at this point, we were already 2 weeks behind anyway, because he'd already been gone for 2 weeks. But I'm going to make sure I do everything I'm supposed to do. That's gathering evidence, talking to everybody I can. I have to keep moving.
So he returns to the effort to find Taish Rue, the estranged wife of the victim, to see what she can say about his life. This time, Morris's luck changes, and finally he finds Taish Rue.
And at the time, she was working at the steel mill as a security guard. So we went over there, and we spoke to her about Mr. Leon Harrison Jr.
They break the news to Taish Rue that her husband is in fact deceased.
We spoke to her very briefly at the steel mill, and we got her to come to the police department.
Taish works as a security guard at a steel mill in the area. JR worked there also. They ask her about his narcotics sales, and she immediately says, oh, that was a very minor, very occasional thing. And then they ask Taish to explain about their marriage.
We've been so off and on since like March of 2016. We got an issue.
At first, she made it seem like everything was good, and then it wasn't so great.
We're talking 6 months he didn't pay me rent. I don't know what he was doing with his money.
They met a few years ago, they got married, but money was always a problem. So they became forced to move in with her father and her brother as a married couple.
We had our issues, like I said, with infidelity.
She had told us they both had issues with infidelity. My understanding was she was doing what she wanted to do and he was doing what he wanted to do.
I realized that he was close to another female. I was kind of upset and angry at that.
Taish explains that JR cheated on her. She discovered this, and she kicked him out. But they had this on-again, off-again relationship for the last few months. They asked her, when's the last time you saw your husband? She said, February 25th.
Time you got off of work, can you tell us what took place?
My husband called me and said he would be at the house.
She said he came by around 10 o'clock in the evening to pick up some of his clothes.
The last time I saw him, he was standing and talking on his phone.
On the phone, just talking to anybody on the phone?
Rosario.
She then says he was on the phone with the other woman that she identifies as Rosario.
Why would I do that?
And they have a heated argument on the phone. Very heated. She says she could hear her through his phone.
You guys check this other girl, Rosario.
We have Thais saying that Rosario is a maniacal, crazy woman who's insanely jealous of her. And if you're out of control, angry, and jealous, what are you capable of? Just about anything, including murder.
When my dad passed, I did want it to be true, but I had to believe it.
Everybody around me was crying. It was like an out-of-body experience, basically. But we just got to sit here and let the police do their job.
Investigators have learned about an enormously out-of-control argument between the victim and his girlfriend. So Morris is now extremely interested in Rosario. When somebody at the front desk says, there's a woman here named Rosario who wants to talk to you.
We appreciate you coming down here.
We did talk to Rosario. She kind of gave us an insight on what their relationship was. They were in some kind of romantic relationship.
She proceeds to tell them how she loves him desperately, and she's found out through other means that he's now dead. Why did you not report him missing?
Why have you not come forward before we say, hey, something's wrong, I don't know where my boyfriend's at?
Well, for one, because he's still married, and I didn't want to interfere in that. And first, I thought it was just maybe he was embarrassed or trying to let it die down because he knows his wife is like rah, 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 you know.
So they asked Rosario, do you know Thais?
It's not a pretty relationship. From my understanding, she cheated first. She's cheated multiple times. He's tried to go back and fix it. And every time he goes back and try to fix it, it's another guy that she's with.
Rosario told us they had a marriage that may not have been going so well.
Thais was saying that this other woman was the source of the rage and the potential threat to JR. Now the other woman is telling a totally opposite tale from Thais. One of these two is lying. Which one is? Either or both? They asked Rosario when's the last time she saw JR. She said February 25th, 3:30 in the afternoon. She picks him up from work.
Around about 9 o'clock, he wanted to go to his dad's house for a bit around.
And later that evening, apparently, JR made his way to the home of his estranged wife, Thais. So they confront Rosario about the angry phone call that supposedly was made by her to JR the night of the 25th. She said, I've never had an angry phone call with JR. However, I got one from Thais.
He was over there, phone ring. It was from his phone, so I answered.
And what time was this?
This had been after 10 by now. And it was the wife. And all I said was hello. And she started talking, yeah, y'all over here, y'all up, which I thought y'all was smarter than me, y'all was like outsmarting me.
She said she called me ranting and raving and screaming at me about being the, quote, other woman, unquote, and it was horrible.
Is this the first time you ever talked to this woman?
No. And I hung up the phone, and then she called back maybe like 5 minutes after that, and I didn't answer. I'm assuming that's when she left the first voicemail.
You really thought you was on top of the world, right? Dumbass.
Taisha's cussing at her and threatening her. I guess she had learned about the relationship and she was mad.
Anything else you can think of that may help us? Anything?
He once mentioned that his wife said that, if she couldn't have him, nobody could. I really feel as though the wife needs to be questioned. I just know for a fact that she's the last person who's seen him.
She hands her phone over to the detectives. They review her text history and calls. This exactly confirms her story. Rosario's not a killer. She's just a heartbroken woman who lost her boyfriend. Now Morris understands Taish is the jealous rage factor, not Rosario.
Has he talked about any specific incidents with anybody else, like a problem with anybody?
The wife's brother, Alex, they don't get along because he's always put in the mix of their issues in their marriage. So, of course, the brother's gonna take the sister's side.
She also goes on to say that Taisha's father, Alex Rue Sr., hates JR, and her brother, Alex Rue Jr., also hates JR because JR is a bad influence on his sister, and Alex Jr. sees himself as his sister's bodyguard. So now we've eliminated Rosario, so we're left with Taish and her family. Morris is buried up to his neck in emotion, lies, finger pointing, an extremely complicated web.
I lost a lot of sleep trying to figure it out and just making sure that you cover every aspect of it.
But he knows he has one thing that is the only physical evidence recovered is the wire used to bind the victim. That could be the answer to this case. Where did that come from?
But we believe that it could have been speaker wire. And a lot of places in Georgetown that sell speaker wire. So I went to Walmart looking to see if there was any kind of wiring that looked like that wiring. The idea would have been if they bought it from there, we could have maybe pulled surveillance footage and seen if we could see them buying it.
They contact the people that work in those departments, and they strike out. Nobody's bought any recently. Nobody sells the kind that they have in their hand. So Morris decides to go see Alex Rue Jr. He works at a garage.
We had got some information that he'd have worked on cars and he may have done some audio stuff in the past.
And a bell goes off in Morris's brain. He works with speaker wire, the very thing that JR is tied up with. He's not there, but the manager is there. Morris says, "Do you employ Alex Rue Jr.?" "Well, I do, but he only comes in a couple days a week. He installs radios in people's cars." "Do you have any of the wire here that he uses?" It's examined and compared to the wire found around the victim, and they're different.
We were not able to locate anything that connected the wire that Mr. Leon Harrison Jr. was bounded with. Could have practically came from anywhere.
So Morris understands he has no crime scene of occurrence. We only have a crime scene of discovery, floating down the Black River toward the Atlantic. But where was he killed? The likely scenario is he died in the Rue household.
Something bad happened in that house.
We had developed enough probable cause, circumstantial evidence to get a search warrant for the house.
We went to her house on High Market Street.
Alex Jr. and Sr. are seated right next to Taish.
We, of course, give them the search warrant, and then they have to come out of the house while we are conducting a search of the house.
We're taking photographs, we're searching rooms, we were looking for cutting objects, speaker wire, any kind of other DNA.
They walk into Taish's bedroom. It's got wall-to-wall carpeting.
We noticed that there was missing pieces of carpet.
A cut piece of carpet's been replaced. Odd corners, odd angles, a terrible patch job. Now, why would you do that? They pull up that insert of carpet.
We removed the carpet padding, and then under there on the subfloor, there was what appeared to be a stain of some sort. We did a presumptive test that come back positive for blood.
Blood is discovered in Taish's bedroom. There's so much blood, it's not just the carpet pad that's soaked, it's the subflooring.
And it looked like there was an attempt to clean up the blood. We spent hours in that room. We found several locations of blood.
There was some high-velocity spatter on walls.
Blood spatter comes from blunt trauma, cast-off blood, from striking or beating someone, and probably an instrument or maybe fists.
Something bad happened in that room, we know that. We could tell by that amount of blood.
And so we processed the house, collected forensic evidence, and sent it off to the lab.
They want to be absolutely certain this is JR's blood, so they run a lab test, and they determine that is, in fact, the case. So JR meets his end in Taish's bedroom. There's an enormous amount of blood. We have binding of a male victim. This is not something that any reasonable person would believe was done by one person, but two people can do that rather easily. This is all a family affair.
Taish, we brought her in again to speak to us.
There is blood in that house. They have circumstantial evidence only, and it's insufficient to proceed to an arrest.
Here's what we know. Your husband's blood is in the bedroom. We're not talking about a speck of blood like a speck of, we're talking saturation.
And I showed her a picture of the subfloor with the saturation on the subfloor of blood.
This is soaked in. This is how big it was. That's your husband's blood.
I think that this has anything to do with him being hurt now. I do not.
Well, you know, anytime he bled that much, because that
for
is...
a nosebleed, yeah.
No, that ain't no nosebleed.
She claimed it was a nosebleed, and my response was, there's just so much blood, I didn't know how it could be a nosebleed.
Taish, you could have had a fire hose up your nose and you wouldn't produce that much blood.
I have no idea why or where this came from.
That is a big injury. That's a life-threatening injury right there.
I will never hurt my husband, and I miss that from the bottom of my heart.
She said that she would never hurt her husband, and then I said, well, somebody did. He was killed in that room.
Was your dad and your brother at the house that night?
To my knowledge, they were.
The theory is quite simple. Taish, can you physically overcome JR? Can you bind him with speaker wire? Can you assault him to the point of death? Can you pick up and remove a dead body and throw it in a river? Not by yourself, you can't. She needs help. The family that kills together stays together.
My family would never do nothing to hurt anybody.
We didn't feel like we were getting honest answers from her.
Can you please give me a lawyer?
Yes, ma'am.
That's good, because you're going to need one.
Once she said she wanted a lawyer, she was free to go at that point.
This investigation has not yet produced probable cause to arrest anybody. Knowing and proving are two different things. For now, it seems unclear who committed what parts to this vicious crime.
At that point, we just have to, like I said, just continue looking for evidence. We want to know everything that happened. We want to know why you're following the evidence.
During this entire case, thus far, Morris has nothing you can explain to a jury or a judge. However, they are fortunate that a fellow named Andrew Johnson comes forward. Okay, Mr. Johnson, what do you know about this?
Did you station that for me?
Andrew Johnson says that after Mr. Harrison had been missing for a couple of weeks, he asked Alex Rue Jr. to drive to Myrtle Beach to help a friend move some furniture. So Alex Jr. agreed.
He started talking. He's like, yeah, you know, and the guy took that to a rock. And my sister fell out, you know, talking about he cheating on my sister.
When Alex told you that he took Leo for a ride, what did that make you think? What did you think he did?
You know, maybe beat him up. But then immediately after, he said he's out of here. He didn't say what he did to him.
Now, Andrew Johnson feels it's important to come in and tell the police this.
Mom, you know what I'm saying? First time said some like that.
Was he saying like he was bragging?
Yeah. And after the funeral and that song told him a miss when he said it, you know, and he was laughing. And I was like, man, what kind of dude is this?
Investigators need to confirm Andrew Johnson's story.
We got phone records. They give us analysis, and that's what we went off of.
They do a GPS location check on Alex Rue Jr.'s cell phone, and it shows that ride taking place to Myrtle Beach on the day when Johnson said it was. So it confirms the fact that that trip did occur. And Johnson says that that's what Rue told him during that conversation. And during that GPS search of Alex Rue Jr.'s cell phone, they also determined at 2 o'clock in the morning he went to the local Walmart, the 26th of February, probably the night that this homicide occurred.
That's one of the only things at that time that was open. We had to look at that video to see if they may have come in Walmart. We went through that Walmart footage. That was a lot of footage we had to go through. And we found them on camera purchasing peroxide.
Hydrogen peroxide is a very effective cleaning agent, particularly when it comes to blood. You have Alex Rue Jr. in that surveillance tape buying hydrogen peroxide, but who's with him? Alex Rue Sr., your old dad. The supposed smarter, older, more calm individual in most families. Not in this family. He's part of the cleanup effort. Now, are there innocent people buying things in Walmart at 2 o'clock in the morning? Sure there are. However, they're not buying hydrogen peroxide to clean up a whole lot of blood in their sister's bedroom. So that is the ultimate nail in the Rue coffin.
We look at that video and getting to the point of making an arrest. It was a good feeling that I was able to accomplish that. That was the first step, to me, in justice.
Homicide investigation is overwhelmingly filled with pressure. That's why when you have somebody by the throat It is absolutely euphoric. So now everyone's in custody. Alex Jr., Taish, and her father. Based on the available evidence, investigators have a pretty clear idea of what happened to Leon Harrison Jr. on the night of February 25th, 2017. Taish and JR had a failing marriage with cheating on both sides, and the rage and the jealousy filled Taish to the maximum. She plotted her revenge, and Taish decided to text JR.
There was some text messages back and forth in a conversation about a candlelight dinner in the bathtub. And that's what he was going over there for.
When he entered the house, she invited him into her bedroom, which I'm sure JR thought was promising. Thought he was going to have a reconciliation with Taish. JR had no idea he was walking into a trap designed to end his life.
There had been, no doubt, a history of conflict between the two, and I feel like that all came to a head that night in the house. Mr. Harrison's wife's brother was there. He got involved.
JR is attacked and subdued and overwhelmed by these people. And wire was used to tie his hands and feet, making him helpless. The beating was part of the rage factor, resulting in JR's demise. The coroner was unable to determine what was the fatal blow, and there's certainly no evidence to say which of these persons delivered that fatal blow.
There was a concerted effort at that point to get rid of the body, to clean up the scene, and to do what they could to distance themselves from that situation.
Then they remove JR from the premises, take him to the Black River, and toss him in. Believing that he's going to float down the river, wind up in the Atlantic Ocean, and never to be seen or heard from again.
We don't know exactly where they dumped him. So much time had went by, I don't know if we'll ever know.
In court, the jury determined the father was only involved in the cleanup and not with the homicide. So they charged him with obstruction of justice. They believed that Taish and her brother, Alex Jr., were the primary killers in this case, and they convicted them of murder. In the end, the judge sentenced Taish and her brother, Alex, to 37 years in prison each, and sentenced the father to 8 years. You're all done.
I cried when I heard the verdict because I knew that we finally got justice. Gerald, he was a hands-on father, hands-on with everything. Like sometimes I just want to pick up the phone and talk to him about his kids.
I haven't had a dad to see the teenage years. So a lot of things that a teenager would need their dad to show them, I really didn't have that. But when I make a touchdown, he was right there beside me.
Every year, we celebrate his birthday and things like that. We release balloons where we found him at, or we'll go to his favorite restaurant. It's not easy, but I know he still's with me.
this homicide case. I mean, that one will always stick out of my mind because it was my first one. And ultimately, we got justice for our family.
Good work, guys. Homicide investigation is the ultimate test of the skill of the investigator. Good police work is the answer to the human condition. It won't prevent anything, but it certainly will punish those responsible. We are the consequences for your behavior. That's what we do. Next time on American Detective, dismemberment is an incredibly evil thing.
Their arms and legs were scattered around.
This perpetrator is intent on covering his tracks, but no one can be careful enough to stop a good detective. We're dealing with one sick individual.
At exactly 5:42 a.m., as the first pale light crept across the rooftops of eastern Paris, a bakery delivery truck idled beside a narrow alley near Rue de Charonne, its engine humming softly, its headlights slicing through the fog. The driver stepped down to stretch, inhaling the cold air, when something caught in the corner of his vision froze him in place. A shape slumped beside a trash bin, unnaturally still, one arm twisted beneath the body, hair matted dark against the concrete. He took one cautious step closer, then another, until the smell reached him, metallic and faintly sweet, and the world seemed to tilt. Within minutes, the sirens began to rise, echoing off the stone walls, tearing through the quiet dawn, pulling the city awake into a nightmare that would never fully release its grip. The victim was a young woman, later identified as Camille Moreau, 26 years old, a freelance graphic designer with a small apartment 2 blocks away, a tidy life, and no known enemies. Her throat bore a thin, precise cut, her hands were scraped raw, and beneath her fingernails, investigators would later find traces of skin that did not belong to her. Her handbag lay several meters away, contents scattered, but her wallet, cash, and identification remained untouched. There was no obvious sign of sexual assault, no witnesses, no weapon. Just a body abandoned in the shadows, and a city already asking the same question in hushed tones. Why her, and why here? The neighborhood was a mosaic of late-night bars, modest apartments, and aging storefronts, a place where students, immigrants, artists, and factory workers collided in the cramped rhythms of everyday life. By mid-morning, yellow police tape strangled the alley, and residents pressed against windows, craning for a glimpse. Some whispered that they had heard a scream just before dawn. Others swore they had seen a man running, but descriptions blurred into contradiction. A black coat, a gray jacket, tall, short, bearded, clean-shaven. Every detail dissolved under scrutiny, leaving only uncertainty and dread. Inside the cramped command van, Detective Laurent Dubois studied the crime scene photographs in silence. 15 years on the homicide squad had taught him to read bodies like broken clocks, to sense patterns where others saw chaos. Yet something about Camille's death unsettled him. The precision of the cut suggested deliberation, control, yet the scattered belongings hinted at haste, panic, or misdirection. There were no defensive wounds consistent with a prolonged struggle, but the abrasions on her palms told a story of brief, desperate resistance. Whoever killed her had approached quickly, struck decisively, and vanished before the city could blink. Neighbors described Camille as reserved, polite, the kind of tenant who watered the hallway plants and held the door for strangers. She worked irregular hours, often late into the night, and had been seen returning home alone shortly after 1 a.m. Her phone records showed no unusual calls. Her emails revealed deadlines, client revisions, casual messages to friends. No threats. No arguments. No secret lover. Her life, laid bare under forensic scrutiny, seemed painfully ordinary. As the hours stretched into days, the investigation widened. CCTV cameras from nearby intersections were reviewed frame by frame, but the alley itself remained stubbornly blind, a dead zone between overlapping fields of view. One camera captured a blurred figure moving quickly at 5:34 a.m., but the resolution was too poor to identify gender, age, or features. Another recorded Camille herself entering the alley less than 10 minutes earlier, her silhouette shrinking into the darkness, unaware of the eyes that might have been tracking her steps. Forensic teams combed every inch of the scene, bagging cigarette butts, fibers, fragments of broken glass. Beneath Camille's fingernails, they found minute traces of epithelial cells, a mix of her own and someone else's. In 2001, DNA profiling was advancing rapidly, but the sample was degraded, partial, a ghost of genetic material that could not be matched to any profile in existing databases. It was carefully cataloged, sealed, and stored, a silent witness waiting for a future that no one could yet imagine. The press descended within hours. Headlines screamed of a brutal killing in the heart of Paris, of a city no longer safe. Candlelight vigils bloomed along the alley, wax dripping onto the pavement where Camille had bled. Her parents, summoned from Lyon, stood in stunned silence as cameras flashed, their grief magnified for public consumption. They pleaded for answers, for justice, for anything that could make sense of the senseless. Leads poured in, hundreds of them, each promising, each dissolving under interrogation. A homeless man who slept nearby was detained, questioned, released. A jealous ex-boyfriend was tracked down in Marseille, his alibi confirmed by security logs and time-stamped receipts. A taxi driver claimed to have picked up a nervous passenger near the scene, but his description matched no one. Each path led to a wall, each breakthrough to another dead end. Weeks became months. Months stretched into years. The file grew thick with reports, photographs, transcripts, its weight a physical reminder of failure. Camille's parents returned to their lives carrying an absence that could not be filled, while the city slowly folded the crime into its collective memory, a shadow among countless others. Yet for Du Bois and his team, the case refused to fade. It haunted their briefings, their late nights, their dreams. Every few years, new technologies prompted fresh hope. The DNA sample was reanalyzed, the partial profile refined, but still no match emerged. Advanced facial reconstruction software attempted to build a suspect's image from scanned descriptions, yielding faces that looked like thousands of men. Geographic profiling suggested possible escape routes, but nothing definitive. The killer remained a silhouette, a presence felt but never seen. In 2008, a new witness came forward, claiming to have heard an argument in the alley shortly before the murder, a woman's voice pleading, a man's low murmur. The account reignited the investigation, but inconsistencies in timing and location ultimately eroded its credibility. The lead collapsed, taking with it another fragile surge of optimism. By 2015, the case was officially classified as a cold case. The file moved from active rotation to archival storage, a quiet bureaucratic funeral. Yet even in cold storage, Camille's name retained a peculiar gravity. Junior detectives were warned about it, told the story as a lesson in humility, in the limits of even the most determined pursuit. The DNA sample, still preserved, became almost mythical, a relic of unfinished business. The years reshaped Paris. Cafes changed hands. New apartments rose where old workshops once stood. The alley itself was repaved, repainted, its walls scrubbed of old stains, but something lingered, an intangible residue that residents felt more than saw. Some claimed the air grew heavier there after midnight. Others avoided the passage entirely, choosing longer routes home. Camille's murder had etched itself into the geography of the neighborhood, a scar no renovation could erase. Then, nearly 2 decades later, a quiet revolution unfolded in forensic science. Genetic genealogy, a technique combining DNA analysis with public ancestry databases, began to crack cases once deemed impossible. Across Europe and North America, long-dormant files stirred. Names surfaced. Doors opened. The past, sealed away, began to breathe again. In Paris, a young forensic analyst named Elodie Marchand was assigned to review a series of unsolved homicides as part of a pilot program exploring these new methods. When she opened Camille's file, the photographs struck her with unexpected force. The simplicity of the crime, the absence of spectacle, made it more disturbing, not less. It felt personal, intimate, as though the killer had reached out from the darkness to claim a single, random life. Elodie requested access to the preserved DNA sample. The lab technicians warned her of its fragility, its history of disappointment, but she persisted. Using updated extraction techniques, she managed to isolate a slightly more complete genetic profile. It was still incomplete, still imperfect, but for the first time, it held the promise of connection. The data was run through international law enforcement databases, producing the same familiar result: no match. Then, cautiously, with layers of legal review and ethical oversight, Elodie submitted the profile to a public genealogy platform, searching not for the killer but for relatives, for distant echoes that might point the way. The wait stretched into weeks. Nothing. Then, one evening, as the lab prepared to shut down, a notification flashed on her screen. A partial familial match. Third to fourth cousin range. A faint genetic whisper crossing borders and generations. The profile belonged to a man in Belgium who had uploaded his DNA in search of ancestral roots. He was not a suspect. He had no criminal record. But he carried a fragment of the same genetic code that had stained Camille's fingernails. The room seemed to shrink around Elodie as she stared at the data. This was the thread. Fragile, nearly invisible, but real. She alerted her supervisor, and within hours, a small task force assembled, veterans and newcomers united by a cautious, electric hope. They mapped the man's family tree, tracing branches backward and outward, following marriages, births, migrations. Names accumulated. Locations spread across France, Belgium, and northern Italy. Hundreds of individuals emerged, all distantly connected, all potential carriers of the unknown killer's DNA. Days blurred into nights as genealogists and detectives worked in tandem, narrowing the field. They searched for men of appropriate age, who had lived in or near Paris in 2001, who had no clear alibi, whose histories held shadows. The list shrank, then shrank again. Eventually, it settled on a cluster of 5 names. Each man became a universe of possibility. Old addresses were revisited. Employment records scrutinized. Former neighbors tracked down. In dusty archives, forgotten documents were unearthed. In quiet phone calls, long-buried memories stirred. Slowly, a pattern began to coalesce, fragile and incomplete, but unmistakable. One of the 5 had lived less than a kilometer from the crime scene at the time of the murder. He had moved frequently, leaving few traces. His work history was fragmented, punctuated by unexplained gaps. Friends described him as withdrawn, volatile, prone to sudden disappearances. Yet he had never been arrested, never formally suspected of violence. To the world, he was invisible. Detectives approached cautiously, aware that a single misstep could shatter months of progress. Surveillance was initiated. Discreet background checks were run. The man, now in his late 40s, lived alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, working irregular shifts as a delivery driver. His life appeared unremarkable, but so had Camille's, until the morning it ended. They needed confirmation. A direct DNA sample. A discarded cigarette, a coffee cup, a used tissue. Anything. The law allowed covert collection in cases of severe crime, but the threshold for certainty was high. They waited, watched, and planned, knowing that the past, once disturbed, rarely revealed itself gently. As winter closed in, the task force moved closer, step by meticulous step, to a truth buried for nearly 20 years. The city went about its routines, unaware that the ghost of 2001 was stirring, stretching, preparing to emerge. In the quiet of the lab, Elodie studied the genetic code again and again, its cryptic sequences now pulsing with ominous clarity. Somewhere in Paris, a man carried the missing pieces of Camille Moreau's final moments, and the distance between them was collapsing. The alley en Rue de Charonne remained silent, its walls bearing no sign of the horror they had witnessed, but beneath the calm surface of the city, something was shifting. The cold case was no longer sleeping. It was awake, and it was moving, inexorably, toward a confrontation that would force the past into the light, whether the present was ready or not. The man did not know he was being watched. Each morning, He stepped out of his building at precisely 6:18, zipped his faded jacket, and lit a cigarette before walking toward the bus stop, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the pavement. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet resident in a city of millions, a solitary figure blending into the rhythm of Paris. To the task force, he was a living question mark, a shadow cast backward across nearly 2 decades of silence. His name was Julian Morel, 48 years old, divorced, no children, no criminal record. His employment history read like a map of instability: warehouse laborer, night security guard, courier, janitor. Short-term contracts, long gaps, addresses scattered across the northeastern districts of Paris and the surrounding suburbs. In 2001, he had lived in a cramped studio apartment barely 800 meters from Rue de Charonne. Detectives reconstructed his movements that year with painstaking care. Rental contracts, utility bills, bank withdrawals, public transport cards. Each document was a fragment of a forgotten life, a faint echo of a man who had passed through the city unnoticed. On the night Camille Moreau was killed, Julian's bank card had been used at an ATM near Place de la Nation at 3:12 a.m., withdrawing €40. The location was only a 10-minute walk from the crime scene. There were no further transactions until 2 days later. No witness had ever mentioned his name. No tip had ever pointed in his direction. He had lived inside the margins of the investigation, invisible, unremarkable, safe. The surveillance team followed him for days. He took the same routes, ate at the same cheap cafes, avoided eye contact, and rarely spoke. He seemed to exist in a narrow corridor of routine, as though any deviation might expose something he preferred to keep buried. When he finished his shifts, he returned directly home, carrying plastic grocery bags, his movements efficient, almost mechanical. They waited for opportunity. It came on a gray Thursday afternoon when Julian stopped at a roadside coffee kiosk, ordered an espresso, and left the paper cup in a trash bin. A plainclothes officer retrieved it moments later, sealing it in a sterile bag, hands trembling with controlled anticipation. The sample was rushed to the lab, where Elodie and her team worked through the night. DNA extraction, amplification, comparison. The results appeared just before dawn. The genetic profile from the coffee cup matched the partial DNA found beneath Camille Moreau's fingernails. The room fell into a stunned silence. No cheers, no celebration, only the heavy, breathless stillness of a truth finally stepping into the light. After 19 years, the ghost had a face. Yet certainty brought no relief, only a deeper unease. Because DNA could tell them that Julian had touched Camille, that their skin had met in violence or struggle, but it could not explain why. It could not reconstruct the path that had led him into that narrow alley, knife in hand, nor could it illuminate the thoughts that had driven him to kill and then vanish into anonymity. A warrant was prepared. The arrest would take place at dawn, the same hour Camille had been discovered. Timing was deliberate, symbolic, unforgiving. At 5:30 a.m., unmarked vehicles rolled quietly into position around Julian's apartment building. Officers ascended the stairwell without a sound, boots barely whispering against concrete. At his door, the team leader raised his fist, held it suspended for a breathless second, then struck. Julian opened the door in a state of half-waking confusion. His eyes widened as he registered the badges, the drawn weapons, the sudden flood of authority. He did not resist. He did not speak. He simply stepped back, hands raised, as if he had always known this moment would come. At the police headquarters on Quai d'Orfèvres, he sat across from Detective Dubois, older now, his hair streaked with gray, his gaze sharpened by years of unrelenting pursuit. Between them lay the weight of 2 decades. Julian's face was impassive, his expression sealed behind a practiced mask. When informed of the DNA match, he blinked once, slowly, and said nothing. When shown photographs of Camille, his jaw tightened, a faint tremor passing through his lower lip before disappearing. Still, no words. The interrogation stretched for hours. Questions circled the same points: his movements in 2001, his relationship to Camille, his reason for being near Rue de Charonne. Julian's answers were sparse, evasive, often contradictory. He claimed he did not remember, claimed the night was a blur, claimed he had never met her, even as the genetic evidence contradicted him. But cracks began to form. He admitted to frequenting the neighborhood bars that year, admitted to walking the streets late at night when sleep eluded him, admitted to episodes of uncontrollable anger, to blackouts that left him with fragmented memories and a lingering sense of dread. Each admission was a thread, and Du Bois pulled gently, patiently, letting the fabric of denial unravel at its own pace. By evening, Julian's defenses were visibly eroding. His posture slumped, his gaze dropped. He rubbed his hands together, as if trying to wash something away that no amount of friction could erase. Finally he spoke. He described a chance encounter, a brief exchange. Camille, he said, had been walking ahead of him in the alley. He had called out, asked for a cigarette, for directions, for anything. She had ignored him, quickened her pace. Something inside him had snapped. The words tumbled out in halting fragments. He remembered grabbing her arm, her shock, her struggle, the knife he always carried for work, suddenly in his hand. The cut, swift and irreversible. The sound she made, more breath than scream. The warmth on his fingers. The moment of terrifying clarity when he realized what he had done. He said he panicked, dropped her, fled. Threw the knife into the Seine days later. Spent months in a haze of fear and self-loathing, convinced every siren was coming for him, every knock at the door the end. When no one came, he learned to bury the memory, to compress it into a locked chamber of his mind, sealed behind routine and silence. Du Bois listened, his face unreadable. He had heard countless confessions, each unique in its horror, yet all echoing the same themes: impulse, loss of control, the irreversible fracture between before and after. Still, this one carried a particular weight. 19 years of evasion. 19 years of freedom. 19 years in which Camille's family had aged in grief, while her killer built a life in the shadows. When news of the arrest broke, it detonated across Paris like a delayed explosion. Headlines erupted. Broadcasts cut into regular programming. Social media ignited with disbelief and fury. The name Camille Moreau, dormant for nearly 2 decades, surged back into public consciousness, carrying with it a wave of collective reckoning. Her parents were informed in a quiet room at the Lyon Police headquarters. They listened in stunned silence as details unfolded, as the abstract promise of justice finally assumed concrete form. Tears came, but not relief, not closure, only a profound exhaustion, as though the long vigil had finally ended, leaving them unsure how to stand without it. In Paris, neighbors of Rue de Charonne gathered again, this time not in mourning, but in shock. Some recalled Julian vaguely, a man who passed them on the stairs, who waited at the same bus stop, who blended seamlessly into the fabric of their days. The idea that he had carried such violence within him unsettled more than it reassured. If he could hide in plain sight, who else might be doing the same? As prosecutors prepared their case, investigators revisited the evidence, reconstructing the crime with renewed clarity. Camille's final movements were mapped minute by minute. Her last phone activity, a message sent at 12:47 a.m., wishing a friend good night. Her footsteps captured on grainy footage. The precise location where she fell, now marked only by a faint discoloration in the pavement, invisible to most, unforgettable to those who knew. In the lab, Elodie reviewed the genetic data again, this time with a sense of awe. A few microscopic cells, preserved against time, had accomplished what years of human effort could not. Yet even as the scientific triumph resonated, she felt an undercurrent of unease. Because the success of genetic genealogy opened doors that could not easily be closed. It promised answers, but also raised questions about privacy, consent, and the reach of surveillance into the most intimate corners of identity. Julian was transferred to a high-security detention facility, where he awaited trial. In the sterile confines of his cell, the routines that had once shielded him dissolved, leaving him alone with memory. Guards reported long periods of motionless staring, broken by sudden bouts of pacing. At night, muffled sounds filtered through the corridors, fragments of speech, half-formed apologies, words swallowed by concrete walls. For Detective Dubois, the arrest brought neither triumph nor peace. He walked the length of Rue de Charonne one evening, tracing the path Camille had taken, letting the city's noise wash over him. The bakery where the truck had idled was now a boutique selling handcrafted candles. The alleys smelled of detergent and rain. Life had moved on, relentlessly, indifferently. Yet beneath the surface, the past remained, coiled and watchful. The cold case was no longer cold. It had been cracked open, spilling its contents into the present. But resolution did not erase the 19 years of unanswered questions, nor could it restore what had been lost. It merely illuminated the fragile boundary between the known and the unknowable, a boundary crossed every time a human choice tipped into irreversible consequence. As the trial date approached, the city held its breath. Testimony would unfold. Details would emerge. The story of Camille Moreau would be told again, this time with an ending. Yet even in the promise of justice, there lingered an inescapable truth. Some mysteries, once unraveled, reveal not clarity, but a deeper, more haunting darkness. And in that darkness, the echoes of Rue de Charonne still whispered, reminding Paris that even the quietest streets can harbor unimaginable secrets, waiting patiently for the moment when time, science, and chance converge to drag them, blinking, into the light. The courtroom was silent long before the judges entered. Wooden benches creaked beneath the shifting weight of spectators. Journalists leaned forward over their notebooks, and cameras hovered in a restrained stillness, waiting. The air carried a faint scent of old paper, polished floors, and restrained tension. At precisely 9 a.m., the doors opened, and Julian Morel was escorted inside, his wrists bound, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls, as if the room itself no longer belonged to him. 19 years of distance collapsed into a single, unbearable moment. Across the aisle, Camille Moreau's parents sat rigid, their hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Time had etched deep lines into their faces, but the grief in their eyes was unchanged, raw and immediate, as though no years had passed at all. For them, this day was not a conclusion. It was a reopening. A forced return to a night that had never truly ended. The prosecutor began with the facts.
Calm, precise,
unemotional. He reconstructed the early hours of March 17, 2001, minute by minute, weaving together CCTV footage, phone records, forensic findings, and witness statements. Each detail landed with surgical clarity. Camille leaving a friend's apartment. The dim alley. The blurred figure approaching. The sudden, violent encounter. The silence afterward. Then came the DNA. The courtroom leaned in as the forensic experts explained how a microscopic trace of skin, preserved under a victim's fingernails, had survived 2 decades, waiting for science to catch up. Charts glowed on screens. Genetic markers aligned. Statistical probabilities soared into the billions. The message was inescapable. Julian Morel had been there. He had touched Camille. He had fought with her. Julian sat motionless, his expression sealed, his jaw clenched. Only once did his eyes flicker toward Camille's parents, and in that fleeting glance lay a storm of emotions too tangled to decipher. Fear, regret, defiance, perhaps even relief. Then his gaze retreated inward, barricading itself behind silence. The defense did not deny the DNA. Instead, they attacked the narrative. They suggested consensual contact, a fleeting encounter, an argument gone wrong. They questioned the reliability of memory after nearly 20 years, the integrity of evidence stored across changing protocols, the ethics of genetic genealogy itself. They spoke of uncertainty, of doubt, of the thin line between scientific innovation and invasive overreach. But the prosecution pressed forward. They introduced the confession. The room held its breath as the recorded interrogation played. Julian's voice, thin and strained, filled the chamber. His fragmented recollections spilled out in halting sentences, punctuated by long pauses. He spoke of anger, of rejection, of a moment when restraint dissolved and instinct seized control. He spoke of the knife, of panic, of flight. Camille's mother covered her mouth, stifling a sob. Her father stared ahead, unblinking, his face carved from stone. When the recording ended, the silence was unbearable. Witnesses followed. The bakery truck driver who had found the body, the forensic technicians who had processed the scene, detectives who had chased dead ends across years. Each testimony layered another weight upon the collective consciousness of the room, building a narrative that no defense could fully dismantle. Yet as the days unfolded, the trial revealed complexities that resisted simple conclusions. Psychiatrists testified about Julian's mental state, a childhood marked by neglect, episodes of dissociation,
Unmanage Trage,
a pattern of emotional withdrawal and isolation. They described a man who had learned to suppress, to compartmentalize, to disappear within himself. Not an excuse, not a justification, but a context that blurred the stark outlines of villainy. Julian himself eventually took the stand. His voice was barely audible at first. He avoided eye contact, addressing his answers to the empty space just beyond the prosecutor's shoulder. He admitted to the encounter, to the violence, to the aftermath. He spoke of living under constant fear, of building routines as shields, of waking each night to the echo of a sound he could never forget. "I did not deserve the years I had," he said quietly. "I know that." The words hung in the air, inadequate and fragile against the enormity of what they sought to confront. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, their faces reflecting a volatile mix of outrage, fascination, and uneasy introspection. Commentators debated the implications of genetic genealogy, its power to resurrect the past, its potential to redefine privacy. Some hailed it as a triumph of justice. Others warned of a future where no secret could remain buried. In cafes and offices across Paris, conversations circled the same questions. How many other killers still walked free, protected only by time and anonymity? How many families waited for answers that might never come? The city, so accustomed to its own resilience, felt newly vulnerable, newly exposed. As the trial neared its conclusion, the focus shifted from guilt to consequence. The prosecution demanded the maximum sentence, life imprisonment, emphasizing the brutality of the act, the prolonged evasion, the enduring suffering inflicted upon Camille's family. The defense pleaded for mercy, citing psychological fragility, remorse, and the long interval since the crime. The judges deliberated for hours. In the waiting room, Camille's parents sat in silence, their bodies heavy with anticipation. They had imagined this moment for nearly 2 decades, yet now that it had arrived, it felt unreal, distant, as though it belonged to someone else's life. They spoke little, their words unnecessary, their shared history too deep for language. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom rose.
Guilty.
Life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 22 years before parole eligibility. A collective exhale swept through the chamber, followed by muffled sobs, quiet murmurs, the shuffle of feet. Julian closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging, the weight of finality settling upon him. Camille's mother wept openly. Her father remained still, his face inscrutable, as though the verdict had answered none of the questions that truly mattered. Justice had been served, the headlines would declare. The cold case was solved, the narrative complete. But outside the framework of law, reality proved more complex. In the weeks that followed, Camille's parents returned to Lyon, their lives once again stripped of structure. The trial had consumed their days, given purpose to their grief. Now, in its absence, they faced a vast, echoing silence. Friends and relatives attempted to comfort them, but words faltered. How does one move forward after waiting 19 years for an ending? Detective Du Bois retired shortly after the trial, his career closing with a case that had haunted its center. On his final day, he walked once more down Rue de Charonne, pausing at the mouth of the alley. He stood there for a long time, absorbing the ordinary sounds of the city, laughter, footsteps, the distant hum of traffic, until the weight of memory softened, just slightly, enough to let him breathe. Elodie Marchand became a quiet figure of renown within forensic circles. Invitations arrived from across Europe, requests to lecture on genetic genealogy, to share methodologies, to consult on other dormant cases. She accepted some, declined others, always mindful of the human cost behind each technical success. For every case solved, she knew countless more remained unresolved, their evidence degraded, their witnesses gone, their stories fading. And then, slowly, a new phenomenon emerged. Families of victims from long-forgotten cases began to reach out. Letters arrived. Emails flooded in. Photographs of sons and daughters, mothers and brothers, faces frozen in time. Each message carried a plea. Look again. Test again.
Try.
The Paris cold case had ignited hope far beyond its own boundaries. Police departments reopened dusty archives. Evidence lockers were unsealed. Samples once deemed useless were reevaluated under the lens of modern science. Across France and beyond, the past stirred. But with revival came unease. Civil liberties groups challenged the expanding use of public DNA databases, raising alarms about consent, surveillance, and the irreversible exposure of genetic identity. Legal battles flared. Policies shifted. Boundaries blurred. The same technology that promised justice threatened to reshape the very notion of privacy. In this turbulent landscape, Camille's story became a symbol, invoked by both sides. To some, she represented the triumph of perseverance and innovation. To others, a cautionary tale about the costs of relentless pursuit. Yet beneath the debates and headlines, the essence of the case remained profoundly human. A young woman had died alone in a narrow alley. A man had carried that truth in silence for 19 years. A city had lived alongside a ghost, unaware. On certain nights, when the streets of eastern Paris fell quiet and the glow of street lamps softened the edges of buildings, residents swore they felt a shift in the air near Rue de Charonne, a subtle change in atmosphere, as though memory itself were breathing. Some avoided the alley still. Others walked through deliberately, an act of quiet defiance, a refusal to let fear dictate geography. Time moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to resolution. Yet the case of Camille Moreau left behind a lingering question, one that no verdict could fully resolve. How many truths still lay hidden, encoded in fragments of forgotten evidence, waiting for the moment when science, chance, and human will would intersect once more? In the deep archives of Paris, shelves still groaned under the weight of unsolved files. Names,
Dates,
places, each one a universe of loss, suspended between past and future. And somewhere among them, in the hushed corridors of memory, the echoes of 2001 persisted, a reminder that even when a cold case is cracked, its shadow continues to stretch across time, refusing to fade completely, whispering that the distance between justice and peace is far greater than any courtroom can measure. The verdict closed the courtroom, but it did not close the case. It merely shifted its gravity, pulling the story inward, deeper into the lives it had scarred, into the hidden spaces where consequences linger long after justice declares itself complete. In the months that followed, Paris seemed to exhale, yet beneath the calm, a low, persistent tremor remained, a reminder that resolution does not always bring relief, and that truth, once uncovered, rarely settles quietly. Julien Morel disappeared into the labyrinth of the French penitentiary system, assigned to a high-security facility where routine replaced autonomy and silence replaced choice. His days became a rigid sequence of wake-up calls, head counts, sparse meals, and enforced solitude. The cell was narrow, its walls stripped of ornament, its single window a dull square of light. Here, time did not flow. It accumulated, pressing down with relentless weight. At night, sleep came in fragments. The past resurfaced in broken images, a flicker of movement in a dark alley, the cold shock of fear, the sound of breath collapsing into silence. He would wake drenched in sweat, his pulse hammering, his mind trapped in a loop he could not escape. For 19 years, he had outrun that moment. Now it waited for him at every turn. Prison psychologists attempted to unravel the tangled threads of his psyche. They spoke of repression, dissociation, delayed accountability. They documented his remorse, his shame, his oscillation between self-loathing and numb detachment. Yet, no clinical vocabulary could fully contain the magnitude of what he had done, or the chasm between understanding and absolution. Across the country, Camille's parents struggled to redefine their lives beyond the framework of mourning and anticipation. For nearly 2 decades, their days had been structured around hope and disappointment, each new lead a fragile lifeline, each dead and another descent into despair. The trial had consumed their energy, given direction to their grief. Its conclusion left them suspended in an unfamiliar stillness. Camille's room remained untouched. Her sketches lay stacked on her desk, her notebooks filled with half-formed ideas, abandoned projects, fragments of dreams that would never reach completion. Sometimes her mother would sit there for hours, tracing the lines of unfinished designs, imagining the woman her daughter might have become. Her father retreated into long walks through the countryside, seeking solace in movement, in a steady rhythm of footsteps that mirrored the slow passage of time. Friends reached out, offering comfort, but words faltered. What do you say to parents who have waited 19 years for an answer, only to find that it does not heal? In Paris, the alley on Rue de Charonne became an unlikely site of pilgrimage. Flowers appeared and vanished. Notes were taped to lampposts, their ink bleeding under rain. Strangers paused, read, and moved on, carrying a borrowed sorrow into their own lives. The city, restless and resilient, absorbed the memory, folding it into its endless cycle of forgetting and remembrance. Meanwhile, the forensic revolution ignited by Camille's case surged forward. Cold cases across France reopened. Investigators dusted off evidence once dismissed as insufficient, re-examining samples with renewed determination. In laboratories, technicians worked late into the night, coaxing genetic secrets from degraded traces. Each successful identification reinforced the promise of science, each failure a stark reminder of its limits. Families who had long abandoned hope began to dream again. In Marseille, a 40-year-old disappearance yielded a name. In Lille, a murder from the early 1990s finally gained a suspect. Across Europe, databases expanded, their digital tendrils reaching into the most intimate dimensions of identity. Justice advanced, but so did unease. Debates intensified. Legal scholars warned of a slippery slope where genetic surveillance could extend beyond violent crime into lesser offenses, eroding civil liberties in the name of security. Ethicists questioned the morality of implicating individuals through relatives who had never consented to law enforcement use of their DNA. Lawmakers scrambled to draft regulations that could contain a technology evolving faster than legislation could follow. Within police circles, tension surfaced. Veteran detectives, raised on intuition and legwork, bristled at the idea of algorithms and databases replacing human judgment. Younger officers embraced the change, viewing it as a necessary evolution in a world where criminals had grown more sophisticated and elusive. Elodie Marchand found herself at the center of this storm. Her inbox flooded daily with messages from families, journalists, policymakers, and researchers. Invitations to speak piled up. Interviews were requested. Her work, once confined to sterile labs, had become a public spectacle. Yet behind the accolades, she felt a persistent disquiet. Each DNA profile represented a life, a lineage, a web of relationships that extended far beyond any single act. With every case solved, countless others were involuntarily drawn into the investigative orbit, their genetic data transformed into tools of pursuit. The boundary between justice and intrusion blurred, and Elodie wrestled with the consequences of her own success. Late at night, Alone in the lab, she often returned to Camille's sample, not to test it again, but to reflect on the improbable chain of events that had carried it across 2 decades. A few microscopic cells, a preserved fragment of struggle, a technological leap, a chance match,
An arrest.
a verdict. So much had hinged on something so small. Yet for all the advances, the cold case unit remained crowded with files that defied resolution. Evidence lost. Witnesses dead. Scenes contaminated. Time, the greatest adversary, continued its relentless erosion. For every story like Camille's, dozens more lingered in limbo, their victims trapped in perpetual uncertainty. Detective Dubois, now retired, watched these developments from the quiet of his suburban home. He read articles, followed debates, listened to interviews. Occasionally, former colleagues called, seeking advice, perspective, reassurance. He offered what he could, though he knew experience could only go so far in a landscape reshaped by technology. Some nights, he dreamed of the alley. In his dreams, he arrived moments too late, the echo of footsteps fading, the body already cooling. He would wake with the same familiar ache, a reminder that no success could fully erase the failures that had preceded it. For him, Camille's case remained a paradox, a triumph that underscored the limits of human effort, a victory that illuminated years of impotence. He had learned to accept that contradiction, to live within it, but acceptance did not equal peace. As seasons turned, the public fascination gradually waned. New scandals erupted. New tragedies claimed headlines. The relentless churn of news cycles pushed Camille's story into the archives of collective attention, where it joined countless others, waiting for historians and documentarians to resurrect it. Yet in quieter spaces, its impact endured. A law student in Bordeaux chose her thesis topic based on the ethical dilemmas raised by genetic genealogy. A forensic science program in Strasbourg revamped its curriculum, inspired by the case. A group of parents in Toulouse formed an advocacy network for cold case families, channeling their grief into collective action. The ripple effect spread outward, subtle but persistent. And still, questions lingered. Julien Morel had confessed, but his account remained fragmented, his memory fractured. Investigators suspected he withheld details, whether deliberately or unconsciously. What had he said to Camille before attacking her? Had there been an argument, a misunderstanding, a moment of hesitation? These nuances, lost to time and trauma, remained inaccessible, sealed within a mind that oscillated between clarity and denial. Camille's final thoughts were even more elusive. Did she recognize her attacker? Did she sense danger? Did she hope for rescue in those last seconds? The answers lay beyond reach, carried away by the same currents that swept her life from the world. In this unresolved residue, the case found its enduring power. It was not merely a story of crime and punishment, of science and justice. It was a meditation on memory, on the fragile threads that bind past to present, on the ways in which human lives intersect in fleeting, catastrophic moments. Paris continued to breathe, its streets alive with movement, its nights filled with music and laughter. Yet somewhere within its vast, intricate network of alleys and avenues, the echo of 2001 persisted, a faint but insistent reminder that beneath every surface lies a history, and that history, once disturbed, never fully returns to sleep. As long as there were unanswered questions, as long as there were families waiting in the shadows of uncertainty, the legacy of Camille Moreau's cold case would endure, shaping not only the future of forensic science, but the moral landscape in which that science must operate. And in that enduring tension, between hope and caution, between revelation and restraint, the story continued, refusing to settle, insisting that the pursuit of truth is never truly complete. The prison gates closed behind Julien Morel with a sound that seemed to swallow all remaining echoes of the world he had once known. Inside, time thickened, stretching into an unbroken continuum of regulated movement and enforced stillness. Days merged into weeks, weeks into months, and the calendar lost its authority, replaced by the relentless rhythm of institutional routine. Yet even in this controlled environment, the past refused to release its hold. Julian's nights were the worst. Sleep came only in fractured intervals, each dream dragging him back into the narrow alley where everything had collapsed. The smell of damp stone, the distant hum of traffic, the weight of his own breath, loud in his ears. He would wake gasping, his heart pounding as though he were still running, still fleeing a scene that no longer existed except inside him. In those moments, the walls of his cell seemed to close in, compressing the years into a single, suffocating instant. Psychologists encouraged him to speak, to confront the memory rather than bury it beneath silence. Some days he complied, recounting fragments, revisiting sensations he had long tried to erase. Other days he withdrew, retreating into an emotional numbness that left his face blank, his voice distant. The oscillation puzzled his evaluators, but to Julian it felt inevitable. How could a mind fully absorb the consequences of an act that had reshaped so many lives? In the quiet of confinement, he began to write. At first, the pages filled with mundane observations, the pattern of light across the floor, the cadence of footsteps in the corridor, the subtle changes in his fellow inmates' routines. Gradually, the entries shifted inward. Memories surfaced. Scenes from childhood. Moments of humiliation, anger, and isolation. Threads of a narrative that, when woven together, hinted at the long, invisible journey toward violence. Yet even in these private confessions, Camille remained elusive. He avoided her name, referring instead to that night, the alley, the moment. To name her was to confront her humanity, and that, he feared, would shatter the fragile equilibrium he had constructed. Outside the prison walls, Camille's parents navigated a parallel struggle. Their home, once animated by anticipation and resolve, now felt hollow, its silence amplified by the absence of purpose. The trial had consumed their days, given structure to grief. With its conclusion, they found themselves adrift, unsure how to inhabit a world no longer oriented around justice delayed. They attempted to return to familiar routines. Morning walks, shared meals, occasional visits with friends. Yet each activity carried the weight of loss, a constant reminder of the life that should have been unfolding alongside theirs. Photographs of Camille lined the hallway, capturing her in moments of carefree laughter, quiet concentration, thoughtful stillness. They stopped to look at them often, as though hoping the images might offer guidance, a path forward. One afternoon, her mother opened a long-neglected drawer and discovered a stack of letters Camille had never mailed. They were addressed to friends, mentors, potential clients, each brimming with ambition and uncertainty. Reading them felt like eavesdropping on a conversation interrupted by fate. In those words, Camille was alive, searching, becoming. The realization struck with renewed force. Her life had been a story cut mid-sentence. The letters became a small ritual. Each evening, her parents read one aloud, letting Camille's voice fill the room. It was painful, but it was also grounding, a way to anchor memory in tangible form, to preserve the contours of a person too easily reduced to a victim. In Paris, the broader implications of the case continued to reverberate. The success of genetic genealogy had unleashed a surge of renewed investigations, and with them, a complex web of legal and ethical challenges. Courtrooms grappled with questions of admissibility. Legislators debated frameworks for oversight. Advocacy groups mobilized, warning against the unchecked expansion of genetic surveillance. In this charged atmosphere, law enforcement agencies walked a precarious line. The promise of resolution tempted them to push boundaries, to test limits, to prioritize outcomes over caution. Each breakthrough reinforced the belief that no crime was beyond reach, that time itself could be conquered. Yet each controversy reminded them that power, once unleashed, rarely remains contained. Elodie Marchand stood at the center of this tension, her work both celebrated and scrutinized. She fielded questions about consent, data security, and the moral weight of implicating individuals through familial connections. Her answers were careful, measured, rooted in a deep respect for both science and humanity. Still, she felt the strain of constant visibility, the burden of representing a technology that transcended her own intentions. Late one evening, after a long day of meetings, she returned to the lab and sat alone before the glow of her computer screen. Rows of genetic sequences scrolled past, their cryptic patterns encoding histories far older than any crime. She wondered how many stories lay dormant within these strings of nucleotides, waiting for circumstances to awaken them. In that moment, she understood with unsettling clarity that every advancement carried an implicit responsibility to decide not only what could be done, but what should be done. The distinction, she realized, would shape the future far more profoundly than any single case. As months turned into a year, the immediate frenzy surrounding Camille's story subsided, replaced by a quieter, more enduring influence. Universities incorporated the case into curricula. Conferences dissected its methodology. Documentarians sought to capture its emotional and scientific dimensions. Through these retellings, Camille became both an individual and an emblem, her life a lens through which broader questions of justice, memory, and technology were explored. Yet for those closest to the story, abstraction offered little solace. Detective Du Bois, though retired, remained tethered to the case through persistent dreams and unbidden reflections. He found himself revisiting old notebooks, tracing investigative pathways that had once seemed promising, now exposed as blind alleys. The exercise was less about regret than comprehension, an attempt to reconcile effort with outcome, to understand how near they had come and how far they had strayed. On a quiet autumn afternoon, he returned to the police archives, requesting access to the original case file. The clerk hesitated, surprised, but complied. In a dimly lit room, Du Bois opened the battered folders, their pages yellowed, their edges softened by countless hands. He read slowly, absorbing each report, each photograph, each marginal note. The experience was disorienting. Names of suspects long cleared, theories abandoned, moments of optimism that now seemed painfully naive. Yet interwoven through the documentation was a persistent determination, a collective refusal to let the case vanish entirely. It was that stubborn persistence, he realized, that had kept the door open long enough for science to step through. As he closed the final folder, Du Bois felt a measure of peace. Not absolution, not triumph, but acceptance. The investigation had unfolded as it needed to, constrained by the tools of its time, propelled by the limits of human perception. The eventual resolution did not negate those efforts, it completed them. Beyond the confines of individual experience, Camille's case began to influence policy. France introduced stricter guidelines for the use of public DNA databases, mandating judicial oversight and explicit criteria for access. Protections for data privacy were strengthened, balancing investigative potential against civil liberties. The reforms were imperfect, contested, and evolving, but they marked an acknowledgement that technological power required ethical scaffolding. These changes rippled outward, informing debates across Europe. International collaborations formed, sharing protocols and best practices. The global forensic community, once fragmented by jurisdictional boundaries, moved toward a more unified framework, shaped in part by the lessons of Paris. Amid these developments, small, intimate moments continued to unfold, often unseen. Camille's parents established a scholarship in her name, supporting young artists pursuing careers in graphic design. Each year, recipients visited their home, sharing portfolios, dreams, and aspirations. In these exchanges, Camille's legacy found renewed expression, her creative spirit carried forward through others. Julian, in prison, learned of the scholarship through a brief mention in a newspaper. The knowledge unsettled him more than any condemnation. To know that Camille's life continued to generate beauty and opportunity, even as his own was confined to concrete walls, intensified his sense of dislocation. He wrote a letter of apology, agonized over each word, then destroyed it, convinced that no message could bridge the chasm between remorse and repair. And still, the questions lingered. What precise sequence of thoughts had propelled him from frustration to violence? What subtle cues, what fleeting impulses had tipped the balance? Could intervention, at some earlier point, have altered the trajectory? These uncertainties haunted not only Julian, but the professionals who sought to understand and prevent such acts. Criminologists studied his case, dissecting psychological profiles, environmental stressors, and social dynamics. They debated the relative influence of nature and nurture, of personal agency and systemic failure. In their analyses, Julian became a subject of inquiry, his individuality subsumed within patterns and probabilities. Yet behind every statistic, every theoretical construct, lay the irreducible complexity of a human life. In the end, the story resisted closure. It lingered in the spaces between law and memory, science and ethics, justice and grief. It persisted in the quiet moments when parents read their daughters' words, when a retired detective revisited old notes, when a forensic analyst contemplated the limits of her craft. The alley on Rue de Charonne remained unchanged, its stones bearing no visible trace of what had occurred. Pedestrians passed through without pause, their lives intersecting only briefly with a history they did not share. And yet, beneath their footsteps, the past endured, an unseen current shaping the present in subtle, irrevocable ways. As the city moved forward, the story of Camille Moreau receded from headlines, but not from consciousness. It became a whispered reference, a cautionary tale, a symbol of both possibility and restraint. In its wake, Paris carried a renewed awareness of vulnerability, a recognition that beneath the endless motion of urban life lay countless narratives, each poised on the edge of transformation. And in that awareness, the legacy of the cold case persisted, a reminder that time may conceal, but it does not erase, and that every truth, however deeply buried, leaves an imprint on the world, waiting for the moment it will rise again. Winter settled over Paris with a muted stillness, wrapping the city in pale light and long shadows. The rhythm of daily life resumed its familiar cadence, yet beneath the surface, subtle shifts were taking place, ripples from a single solved case spreading outward in ways few could predict. The streets were the same, the cafes still crowded, the metro still groaning beneath the weight of commuters, but something in the collective consciousness had altered, as though the city itself had absorbed a lesson about fragility and time. In the high-security prison where Julian Morel served his sentence, the seasons announced themselves only through the changing angle of sunlight that slipped through the narrow window of his cell. Each morning, the pale beam traced a slow arc across the floor, a silent chronicle of passing days. He measured time not in weeks or months, but in these shifting lines of light, in the gradual erosion of memory, in the dulling of sensation that accompanied prolonged isolation. The writing continued. Page after page, he filled notebooks with fragments of thought, memories surfacing and dissolving in uneven rhythm. Some entries were precise, detailing childhood scenes with startling clarity. Others were incoherent, tangled in emotional static. Yet always, beneath the words, ran a current of unresolved tension, an awareness that no amount of reflection could rewrite what had been done. Occasionally, he reread his earlier pages, searching for patterns, for explanations that might transform horror into understanding. He found none, only the unsettling recognition that violence, once unleashed, obeyed no logic beyond its own momentum. This realization offered neither comfort nor absolution, only a stark reminder of the limits of introspection. In rare moments of fragile lucidity, Julian imagined Camille's life unfolding in some alternate timeline. He pictured her exhibitions, her clients, her laughter echoing through sunlit rooms. These visions tormented him, yet he returned to them compulsively, as if proximity to what he had destroyed might approximate atonement. The exercise always ended the same way, in silence, broken only by the distant clang of metal doors. Meanwhile, Camille's parents confronted a different kind of emptiness. With the trial behind them, the urgency that had once propelled them forward dissipated, leaving a void that daily routines struggled to fill. They found solace in small acts of remembrance. A vase of fresh flowers beneath her photograph. A candle lit each evening. The scholarship fund grew slowly, supported by donations from strangers moved by Camille's story. Each contribution carried a message of solidarity, a brief acknowledgement that their daughter's life continued to matter beyond its tragic conclusion. Yet grief remained an ever-present companion, its contours shifting but never fading. On certain nights, Camille's mother dreamed of her daughter standing at the foot of the bed, silent, watchful. She would wake with tears on her cheeks, unsure whether the dream had been a visitation or a manifestation of longing. Her father coped differently, immersing himself in practical tasks, repairing fences, tending gardens, fixing old furniture, anything that allowed his hands to stay busy while his mind drifted. Together, they navigated the uneasy terrain of life after resolution, discovering that answers, once obtained, do not necessarily soothe. Instead, they often sharpen the edges of loss, illuminating the full magnitude of what has been taken. Across the city, Elodie Marchand entered a period of profound introspection. Her professional success had opened doors, but it had also placed her beneath a relentless spotlight. Every decision she made now seemed weighted with symbolic significance. Each new case brought not only the promise of justice, but the specter of ethical compromise. She found herself questioning long-held assumptions about the role of science in society, about the delicate balance between innovation and restraint. In private moments, she revisited the earliest days of her career, recalling the idealism that had first drawn her to forensic genetics. She had believed, with youthful certainty, that truth was an unambiguous good, that its discovery justified any means. The reality she now confronted was far more complex. Truth, she realized, could wound as deeply as it healed. One evening, after a particularly contentious panel discussion, she walked alone along the Seine, watching reflections shatter across the dark water. She thought of the knife Julian had thrown into this same river, the symbolic attempt to erase evidence, to consign memory to oblivion. Yet the river, relentless in its flow, had not absolved him. Instead, time and science had reached back through its currents to reclaim what was lost. The thought unsettled her. If nothing could truly disappear, if every act left an indelible trace, then what responsibility did humanity bear for the cumulative imprint of its choices? These questions accompanied her into the lab, into meetings, into sleep. They transformed her work from a pursuit of resolution into an ongoing meditation on consequence. Meanwhile, the resurgence of cold case investigations accelerated. Law enforcement agencies, buoyed by public support and technological promise, reopened files long deemed unsalvageable. Families gathered once more in police stations, their faces etched with cautious hope. Each new lead, each tentative match, rekindled emotions that had lain dormant for years. Some cases found swift resolution. Others unraveled under scrutiny, their evidence too degraded, their witnesses irretrievable. The contrast underscored a painful truth. Science could extend the reach of justice, but it could not guarantee it. For every story that ended in clarity, many more remained suspended in uncertainty. Public discourse grew increasingly polarized. Editorials praised the courage of investigators, the persistence of families, the ingenuity of scientists. Counterpoints warned of genetic surveillance becoming normalized, of privacy sacrificed at the altar of security. Social media amplified extremes, reducing nuanced debates to incendiary slogans. In this charged environment, the human stories at the heart of each case risked being overshadowed by ideological conflict. To counter this, a group of journalists embarked on a series of long-form investigations seeking to capture the lived experiences behind the headlines. They interviewed parents, siblings, detectives, forensic analysts, and even former inmates. Their reports wove together threads of grief, hope, frustration, and resilience, reminding readers that each cold case was not merely a puzzle to be solved, but a wound carried by real people. Camille's parents participated reluctantly, wary of reopening public scrutiny. Yet they ultimately agreed, hoping their perspective might humanize a debate drifting toward abstraction. In the quiet of their living room, they spoke of small memories: Camille's habit of sketching on napkins, her fondness for late-night walks, her laughter when rain caught her unprepared. These details, mundane and intimate, restored dimension to a life too often reduced to a crime scene. The resulting article resonated deeply, prompting an outpouring of letters from readers who saw in Camille reflections of their own children, siblings, friends. The collective response underscored a simple yet profound reality: tragedy connects strangers through shared vulnerability. In prison, Julian received news of these developments through fragmented media reports. Each mention of Camille's name struck like a physical blow. He oscillated between a desire to shield himself from further reminders and a compulsion to know how her story continued to unfold. Ultimately, he chose avoidance, requesting that newspapers be withheld, retreating deeper into the controlled monotony of incarceration. Yet isolation offered no refuge from memory. During mandatory therapy sessions, he was encouraged to articulate his remorse, to confront the moral dimensions of his actions. Some days he complied, speaking haltingly of guilt and regret. Other days, he lapsed into silence, his eyes fixed on some distant point. The therapists noted progress and regression in equal measure, uncertain whether true transformation was possible within the confines of such an environment. Beyond the prison, new narratives emerged, challenging simplistic notions of justice. In several reopened cases, genetic genealogy implicated individuals who vehemently denied involvement, sparking legal battles that tested the boundaries of evidence and due process. Courts grappled with unprecedented questions. How reliable were familial matches? What constituted sufficient corroboration? How should errors be addressed when reputations and lives hung in the balance? These controversies injected caution into an atmosphere previously charged with optimism. Investigators learned to temper enthusiasm with skepticism, to corroborate genetic leads through traditional means, to respect the gravity of accusation. The pendulum swung toward equilibrium, a tentative synthesis of innovation and prudence. Elodie, now a senior consultant, advocated relentlessly for this balance. In workshops and seminars, she emphasized the limitations of DNA, its susceptibility to contamination, misinterpretation, and misuse. She urged her colleagues to treat genetic data as a guide, not a verdict, to remember that behind every sequence lay a human story. Her message resonated, shaping protocols and influencing training programs. Slowly, the culture of forensic investigation evolved, integrating technological prowess with ethical vigilance. Yet, even as institutions adapted, the emotional landscape remained volatile. For families awaiting answers, each announcement of a solved case was a double-edged sword, inspiring hope and amplifying despair in equal measure. Support groups formed, offering spaces for shared experience, mutual encouragement, and collective mourning. In these gatherings, stories unfolded that rivaled any crime novel in complexity and sorrow: disappearances spanning generations, murders shrouded in rumor, lives suspended between certainty and doubt. Camille's parents attended one such meeting, hesitant but curious. There, they encountered others who had endured decades of uncertainty, whose losses remained unresolved. The exchange was both humbling and galvanizing. They realized that while their own journey had found a measure of closure, countless others still wandered in darkness. From this realization emerged a renewed sense of purpose. Together with other families, they began advocating for expanded resources for cold case units, for sustained funding, for psychological support services. Their efforts gained traction, drawing attention from policymakers and philanthropic organizations. In time, new grants were established, dedicated to the long-term pursuit of unresolved cases. This grassroots movement, born of shared grief, transformed personal loss into collective action, a testament to the resilience of those who refused to let silence prevail. As years accumulated, the immediate intensity of Camille's story softened, settling into the broader tapestry of Parisian history. Yet its influence persisted, woven into legal reforms, scientific practices, and cultural memory. It became a reference point, a benchmark against which new cases were measured, a reminder of both the power and the peril inherent in the pursuit of truth. On quiet evenings, when the city lights shimmered across the Seine and conversations drifted through open windows, it was possible to sense the subtle presence of all that had transpired. The alley on Rue de Charonne, unremarkable by day, seemed to hold its breath at night, as though conscious of its own past. Pedestrians crossed its threshold unaware, their footsteps layering new histories atop old. Life moved forward, relentless and indifferent, yet always carrying within it the echoes of what had come before. In this convergence of memory and motion, the legacy of the cold case endured, a silent companion to the present, whispering of fragility, of consequence, and of the enduring human need to seek meaning in the face of irrevocable loss. Spring arrived quietly, slipping into Paris on soft currents of warmer air, carrying with it the scent of blossoms and the distant murmur of riverboats. The city responded instinctively, terraces filling, windows opening, voices rising into the streets. Yet beneath this seasonal renewal, the emotional aftershocks of a long-buried crime continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways both visible and unseen. In the prison where Julien Morel lived out his sentence, the changing season announced itself only through faint shifts in temperature and light. The narrow window admitted a slightly brighter glow, tracing a fragile line across the wall. To Julien, the change felt unreal, as though spring belonged to a world he could no longer access. He marked the days in his notebook, not with dates, but with reflections, fragments of thought that circled endlessly around memory and consequence. He began to experience moments of unexpected clarity. During these episodes, the fog of denial lifted, revealing the stark contours of his actions. The realization struck with renewed force each time. A single impulse had irrevocably altered countless lives. He could trace the cascade of effects outward, from Camille's parents to the investigators, the journalists, the scientists, the strangers who now spoke her name. In this expanding network of impact, his own existence seemed to shrink, reduced to a cautionary silhouette. These moments did not last. They dissolved quickly into numbness, a psychological defense against unbearable guilt. Yet even in retreat, he could not fully escape the awareness that his story had become inseparable from Camille's, bound together in a narrative neither had chosen. Across France, the reverberations of the Paris case continued to reshape investigative culture. Cold case units expanded, drawing personnel from diverse disciplines: traditional detectives, forensic scientists, genealogists, data analysts. Their collaboration forged new methodologies, blending intuition with algorithmic precision, experience with innovation. In training academies, recruits studied the case as both exemplar and warning, a testament to perseverance and a reminder of ethical complexity. This institutional transformation carried a human dimension. Officers accustomed to the immediacy of active investigations now confronted the slow, methodical demands of historical inquiry. They learned patience, resilience, and the art of sustaining hope amid prolonged uncertainty. For many, the work became deeply personal, an intimate engagement with lives interrupted, stories unfinished. In these units, Camille's name surfaced often, invoked as a symbol of possibility. Yet it was the photographs, the handwritten notes, the faded documents that anchored abstract ambition in tangible reality. Each file represented not merely a puzzle, but a life once fully lived, now suspended between memory and resolution. Families of victims, once isolated by grief, found new avenues of connection. Support networks grew, linking individuals across cities and borders. Through meetings and online forums, they shared experiences, strategies, and moments of fragile optimism. In these exchanges, sorrow became communal, its weight distributed across many shoulders. Camille's parents played an active role in these gatherings, offering guidance drawn from their own arduous journey. They spoke candidly about the long years of waiting, the corrosive uncertainty, the emotional toll of repeated disappointment. They cautioned against unguarded hope, yet encouraged perseverance, emphasizing the unpredictable convergence of chance and persistence that had ultimately yielded answers. Their words carried authority, tempered by lived experience. For those still searching, they provided a model of endurance, a reminder that even in the absence of certainty, purpose could be forged. In Paris, the cultural memory of the case began to evolve. What had once been a shocking headline transformed into a reference point, woven into broader narratives about justice, science, and accountability. Filmmakers and writers approached the story with sensitivity, seeking to explore its emotional depth rather than sensationalize its violence. Documentaries emphasize the quiet heroism of persistence, the painstaking labor behind each forensic breakthrough, the human cost of unresolved grief. These portrayals shaped public perception, fostering a more nuanced understanding of cold cases as protracted human dramas rather than isolated events. The emphasis shifted from spectacle to empathy, from shock to reflection. In this reframing, Camille emerged not only as a victim, but as a presence whose life and legacy continued to inspire inquiry and compassion. Yet even as the story matured, it remained susceptible to distortion. On social media, fragments circulated stripped of context, repurposed for outrage or conspiracy. Debates flared over the reliability of genetic evidence, the integrity of institutions, the motives of investigators. In this volatile digital environment, truth competed with speculation, nuance with absolutism. The complexity of the case, its moral ambiguities, its layered history, risked being flattened into simplistic narratives. Elodie Marchand confronted this challenge directly. She engaged with journalists, educators, and community leaders, advocating for informed discourse. In public lectures, she dissected the scientific process behind genetic genealogy, demystifying its mechanisms and limitations. She emphasized the importance of corroboration, of rigorous standards, of humility in the face of uncertainty. Her goal was not merely to defend a technology, but to cultivate a culture of critical engagement. The effort demanded emotional resilience. Each public appearance required her to revisit the details of Camille's death, to navigate the raw emotions of families and the skepticism of critics. Yet she persisted, driven by a conviction that transparency and dialogue were essential to sustaining public trust. In quieter moments, she grappled with her own evolving identity. Once a behind-the-scenes technician, she had become a public figure, her work scrutinized and interpreted through multiple lenses. The transformation unsettled her, forcing a reassessment of priorities and boundaries. She sought solace in the solitude of the lab, in the precision of molecular analysis, in the silent language of genetic code that had first drawn her to the field. There, amid centrifuges and sequencers, she found a measure of equilibrium, a reminder that beneath the noise of public discourse lay a discipline grounded in meticulous observation and patience. Meanwhile, Detective Dubois, navigating retirement, confronted an unexpected sense of displacement. For decades, his identity had been inseparable from his role as investigator, his days structured by pursuit and analysis. With the case resolved and his career concluded, he faced a void he had not anticipated. Leisure felt foreign, unearned. He filled his time with reading, walking, occasional volunteer work, yet a persistent restlessness lingered. One afternoon, he accepted an invitation to speak at a police academy, addressing cadets eager to learn from a veteran's experience. Standing before them, he recounted the long arc of Camille's case, emphasizing the virtues of patience, humility, and perseverance. He spoke of failure as teacher, of uncertainty as companion, of the necessity of doubt in the pursuit of truth. The cadets listened intently, their faces a mix of idealism and apprehension. In their eyes, Dubois glimpsed echoes of his younger self, driven by conviction, untempered by experience. The encounter left him contemplative, aware of the cyclical nature of vocation, the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. As summer approached, Paris prepared for its annual rhythms of travel and celebration. Tourists crowded landmarks, Festivals animated public squares, and life surged forward with renewed energy. Yet in the quieter quarters of the city, the legacy of 2001 remained a subtle undercurrent, shaping attitudes towards safety, community, and memory. Residents of Rue de Charonne continued their routines, but many paused briefly when passing the alley, a gesture of acknowledgement, conscious or not. Some left flowers anonymously, others whispered brief prayers. These acts, small and ephemeral, testified to the enduring imprint of a single life upon collective consciousness. In prison, Julian observed these developments from a distance, informed by fragmented reports and occasional correspondence from his legal counsel. Each mention of Camille's ongoing influence deepened his sense of estrangement. He oscillated between resignation and despair, recognizing that his own narrative would forever be defined by a moment he could not undo. During one therapy session, he spoke haltingly of this realization, articulating for the first time the fear that haunted him, not of punishment, but of irrelevance. He feared becoming a footnote in Camille's story, a shadow eclipsed by her enduring presence. The therapist listened, refraining from judgment, guiding him toward an acceptance of accountability divorced from self-pity. It was a slow, uneven process, marked by setbacks and brief advances. Yet in these exchanges, a fragile possibility emerged that confronting one's own insignificance in the wake of harm might open a path toward genuine remorse. Outside, the broader societal dialogue continued to evolve. As genetic genealogy matured, protocols tightened, oversight expanded, and ethical frameworks solidified. The initial fervor gave way to measured integration, a recognition that technological power demanded disciplined restraint. This maturation mirrored the emotional trajectory of Camille's case, which had moved from shock to reflection, from urgency to contemplation. In universities, students debated its implications, probing the intersections of law, science, and morality. In classrooms, teachers used it to illustrate the complexities of modern justice. In families, it sparked conversations about safety, vulnerability, and the unpredictability of human behavior. Through these myriad engagements, the story transcended its origins, becoming a prism through which society examined itself. And yet, at its core, it remained a deeply personal tragedy, a life interrupted, a future foreclosed. This tension between individual loss and collective meaning infused the narrative with enduring resonance, ensuring that it would not fade easily into obscurity. As dusk settled over Paris one evening, the city bathed in amber light, the Seine reflecting fractured gold, it was possible to sense the convergence of past and present, the invisible threads linking countless lives across time. In this convergence, the echoes of 2001 persisted, not as a source of fear, but as a call to vigilance, empathy, and reflection. The cold case, once a silent archive, had become a living story, its reverberations shaping not only institutional practices, but the inner landscapes of those it touched. And in that ongoing transformation, the legacy of Camille Moreau continued to unfold, guiding the city toward a deeper understanding of loss, responsibility, and the fragile boundaries that define human existence. The silence inside the evidence archive felt heavier than stone. Rows of steel shelves stretched into darkness, stacked with boxes that carried thousands of forgotten lives, sealed in cardboard and dust, each label a quiet witness to a story left unresolved. The air smelled faintly of paper, metal, and cold, the sterile scent of time standing still. Detective Elodie Marchand stood motionless in the narrow aisle, her eyes fixed on a faded file number, PA 2001-10-443. Camille Durand. 20 years. 2 decades of unanswered questions. 2 decades of a mother waiting. She lifted the box carefully, as if afraid the fragile weight of the past might collapse in her hands, and carried it to the stainless steel examination table beneath harsh fluorescent light. Inside, everything was meticulously preserved, photographs sealed in plastic sleeves, brittle reports yellowed at the edges, handwritten notes from detectives long retired or long dead. And beneath it all, Wrapped in sterile packaging and labeled with methodical precision, lay a single hair, 7 centimeters long. No root, no follicle. In 2001, it had been nothing more than a biological dead end. In 2021, it was a doorway. Marchand exhaled slowly, then sealed the sample inside a modern sterile container and placed it into a refrigerated transport case. "This is it," she whispered. "This is our ghost." The laboratory hummed with quiet urgency. Inside its glass walls, machines glowed in cold blue and white, tracing invisible codes buried inside molecules no human eye could ever see. Technicians moved with practiced precision, each step controlled, measured, flawless. Any error could destroy the sample, the final remaining trace of a killer who had slipped through time's fingers. The hair was subjected to next-generation DNA sequencing, a technology capable of extracting genetic data from fragments once considered useless. Hours passed, then days. Marchand returned every morning, standing behind the observation glass, watching scientists coax information from the microscopic remains. And then, finally, the call came. "We have a profile." 3 words. 3 words that shattered 20 years of silence. The DNA was not only viable, it was complete. A full genetic fingerprint.
Clean. Clear.
Indisputable. Marchand felt her pulse hammer in her ears. For the first time since 2001, Camille Durand's killer was no longer invisible. The DNA profile was uploaded into France's National Criminal Database. Hours passed. No match. Then days. Still nothing. The system returned the same answer again and again. No known offender. No criminal history. No recorded arrest. No fingerprint record. A ghost. Again. But the investigation did not stop. This time they pushed further. Into territory once considered controversial. Genetic genealogy. A method that traced distant relatives through open-source ancestry databases, a technique that had shattered dozens of cold cases across Europe and the United States. If the killer had no record, perhaps someone in his bloodline did. The DNA profile was processed, broken into markers, and released into international genealogical networks. Then they waited. 3 days. On the 4th morning, the silence broke. A partial familial match. Not a suspect. A relative. 3rd cousin, twice removed. A woman in southern France who had submitted her DNA for ancestry research. The implication was staggering. The killer had family. A lineage. A traceable path through time. The hunt began. Whiteboards filled the task force room. Names.
Dates.
Birthplaces. Marriages.
Deaths.
Migration patterns. One family tree expanded into dozens, then hundreds of branches. Each generation split into dozens more. It was genealogical warfare. Analysts reconstructed 4 generations backward, then forward, narrowing the field through age, gender, geography, and proximity. Who would have been? Male. Physically capable. Living or working in Paris in 2001. Between 20 and 45 years old. Slowly, the list shrank. From hundreds to dozens. From dozens to 6. 6 men whose genetic lineage matched the unknown DNA. 6 lives. 6 possible killers. They dissected each one. Employment records. Residences. Criminal history. Travel logs. 3 were ruled out within hours. One had been in prison during October 2001. Another was living in Canada. The 3rd was hospitalized following a severe accident. 3 remained. Each one a shadow. Each one capable. Each one dangerous. Then came the breakthrough. One name glowed red on the board. Laurent Moreau. Age 52. Elevator maintenance engineer. Former Paris resident. Lived within 3 kilometers of Camille's apartment in 2001. A man who had worked alone, unsupervised, inside dozens of residential buildings. A man who disappeared from Paris less than 2 years after the murder. And a man with a sealed domestic violence report buried deep inside outdated municipal archives. The room fell silent. Every instinct screamed the same thing. They had found him. Surveillance began immediately. Moreau now lived in a modest apartment block in Aulnay-sous-Bois, a quiet suburb north of Paris. His life was small, controlled, almost invisible. Each morning, he left at 6:20 a.m. Each evening, he returned at 7:05 p.m. He shopped at the same grocery store, drank coffee at the same corner cafe, sat at the same table. Every day, routine, predictable, like a man hiding in plain sight. Officers tracked his movements, studied his patterns, waited for opportunity. They needed his DNA. Legally.
Cleanly.
Without alerting him. The chance arrived on a rainy Thursday. Moreau entered his usual cafe, ordered a black espresso, drank it slowly, then left the porcelain cup behind. Minutes later, an undercover officer retrieved it. The rim glistened faintly. Saliva. Enough. The cup was sealed, catalogued, and rushed to the lab. Hours later, the result appeared on the screen. Match. 100%. Statistical certainty. 1 in 7.8 trillion. Beyond doubt. Beyond appeal. Beyond escape. The ghost now had a name. The arrest was scheduled for dawn.
Precision mattered.
Speed mattered. Surprise mattered. At 5:47 a.m., armored vehicles rolled silently into Moreau's residential block. Officers took positions at every entrance. Snipers covered the windows. Tactical units prepared the breach. A battering ram slammed into the apartment door. Police. Do not move. Moreau was standing in his kitchen, barefoot, holding a mug of coffee. For a moment, his eyes showed confusion. Then comprehension. Then resignation. He did not resist. He did not flee. He simply lowered the cup, raised his hands, and whispered, "It took you long enough." Inside the interrogation room, time collapsed. 20 years stood face to face with the present. Moreau sat motionless, staring at the metal table. His face showed no rage, no fear, only exhaustion. The DNA evidence was placed before him. The genealogy charts, the location data, the forensic reports, the timeline. Every wall closed in. 7 hours passed. Then 8. Finally he spoke. His voice was barely audible. "I didn't plan to kill her." Silence filled the room. "I went inside to steal. I had keys. I worked in that building. I thought it was empty." His hands trembled. "She came out of the bedroom. She screamed. I panicked." He closed his eyes. "I grabbed her. She struggled. Then she stopped." He exhaled sharply. And everything after that was just running. The confession sent shockwaves through France. News headlines erupted. Paris cold case solved after 20 years. Hidden DNA exposes killer. Technology breaks silence. The city reeled. Camille's name returned to the streets, to the screens, to the conversations whispered on metro platforms and cafe terraces. And in a quiet suburban home, Camille's mother received the call she had waited for 2 decades to hear. They found him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, softly, "Thank God." But justice came with bitter weight. Moreau had lived freely for 20 years. 20 birthdays. 20 summers. 20 Christmas mornings. While Camille lay frozen in time. While her family lived inside unanswered grief. The courtroom overflowed. Journalists.
Detectives.
Citizens. All drawn by the gravity of closure. Moreau stood silently as the verdict was read. Life imprisonment. No possibility of parole. No expression crossed his face. Only emptiness. Yet the echo of the crime refused to fade. Because closure does not erase loss. It only changes its shape. And long after the verdict, investigators continued asking one haunting question. How many more killers walk free? How many more ghosts wait inside forgotten boxes? How many silent samples lie dormant, waiting for technology to catch up with truth? In cold storage rooms across Europe, tens of thousands of cases remain unresolved. each one a ticking clock, each one a future confession waiting to be unlocked. Camille Durand did not know that a single strand of hair would one day rewrite her story, that science would resurrect her voice, that persistence would reach across time and pull her killer back into the light. But her case became proof that silence is temporary, that time does not protect the guilty, and that no crime, no matter how carefully hidden, can remain buried forever. Because the smallest trace can outlive the strongest lie. And because justice, when armed with memory and technology, never truly forgets. The night after the confession, Paris did not sleep. Rain slid down dark windows. Sirens echoed through empty streets. In quiet apartments, televisions flickered with breaking news banners, repeating the same words over and over, as if the city itself was trying to understand them. Cold case solved. Arrest made. Killer identified. But inside the interrogation wing of the Prefecture de Police, the truth was still unfolding, slowly, painfully, one fractured memory at a time. Laurent Moreau sat alone in a narrow cell, his back against the concrete wall, eyes fixed on nothing. The echo of his own words still rang in his ears. 20 years of silence had cracked open, and what spilled out was not relief, not remorse, but something far darker. Because confession was only the beginning. At 3:12 a.m., Detective Marchand entered the room again. Her footsteps were soft, deliberate, almost respectful, as if stepping across a sacred boundary between past and present. She carried no files, no photographs, no evidence. Only a digital recorder and a glass of water. She placed the glass in front of him. "You said you panicked," she began quietly. "I want you to tell me everything. From the moment you entered the building." Moreau's fingers twitched.
His jaw tightened.
For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly he spoke. "I had master keys. For maintenance. Old buildings. Weak locks. Easy access." His voice was flat, detached, as if narrating someone else's life. "I'd done it before.
Just small thefts. Cash. Jewelry.
Things people wouldn't notice right away." He swallowed. "That night I chose her building because the hallway lights were broken. Cameras didn't work. No concierge. Perfect." Marchand remained silent. I entered the apartment. I was already inside when I heard her. His breath caught. She came out of the bedroom, barefoot, half asleep,
confused.
Then she saw me. A pause. She screamed. The word echoed like a gunshot. She tried to run. I grabbed her arm. She fought, harder than I expected.
His hands trembled now.
She scratched me,
bit me.
I could smell her shampoo. I remember thinking this wasn't supposed to happen. Marchand leaned forward slightly. And then, his eyes closed. I pushed her. Silence filled the room.
She fell.
Hit her head.
Hard.
Against the table. Another pause. She didn't move. In the sterile brightness of the room, the seconds stretched like centuries. "You didn't call for help," Marchand said softly. "No," he whispered. Fear entered his voice for the first time. I checked her pulse. I thought she was dead. But she wasn't. He flinched. "I don't know." I panicked. I was already in too deep. His shoulders slumped. "So, I made sure." The words landed like a blade. Forensic experts had long suspected asphyxiation following blunt force trauma. Now, the missing piece slid into place. Moreau continued, his voice barely above breath. "I cleaned everything. Took the sheets. Wiped the handles. Burned my clothes." He laughed weakly. I thought I was smart. Marchand let the silence do its work. "Why didn't you stop?" she asked. His eyes opened. They were empty. Because stopping meant prison. And I wasn't ready to lose my life. A pause. So I took hers. By dawn, the full confession filled more than 70 pages. Each detail sharper than the last. Each memory reopening wounds the city had never healed. When investigators cross-checked his statements with the original crime scene reports, The alignment was terrifyingly precise. The placement of furniture, the direction of the blood spatter, the missing jewelry, even the exact brand of cleaning solvent used. Details never released to the public. Details only the killer could know. The case was sealed, but its consequences were just beginning. As the sun rose over Paris, crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Television trucks lined the streets. Journalists jostled for position. Families of other cold case victims stood among them, holding faded photographs, their eyes burning with fragile hope. If Camille's killer had been found after 20 years,
who else could still be out there?
Inside, prosecutors prepared charges: voluntary homicide, armed burglary, destruction of evidence. But the true weight of the case lay beyond legal terminology. It lay in the psychological wreckage left behind. Camille's mother, Helene Durand, arrived just after noon. Her steps were slow, careful, as if the building itself might shatter beneath her feet. 20 years of waiting had carved deep lines into her face, but her posture remained proud, unbroken. When she entered the courtroom, silence spread outward like a tide. She took her seat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor, directly facing the man who had stolen her daughter. Moreau refused to look at her. His eyes remained locked on the floor. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then quietly she spoke. "You destroyed my life." The room froze. "My husband died waiting for answers." Her voice trembled, but did not break. "My grandchildren never knew their aunt." A pause. "And every night for 20 years, I replayed her last moments in my head, imagining her alone." Her breath shook. "And now I know she was terrified." Moreau's shoulders curled inward. Tears slid down his face. But it was too late. Across France, psychologists weighed in. They spoke of predatory opportunism, of criminals who commit spontaneous acts, not driven by long-term planning, but by sudden opportunity and fear. Men like Moreau, they said, were among the most dangerous, because they were invisible. Neighbors, workers, fathers, faces that blended seamlessly into the background of everyday life. The case shattered illusions. It forced a nation to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a uniform, carries a toolbox, smiles politely in elevators. Meanwhile, detectives return to the archive, because one solved case often leads to others. And Laurent Moreau had lived in Paris for over 15 years. 15 years. Thousands of apartments. Thousands of opportunities. The question burned. Was Camille the only one? They reopened unsolved burglaries, assaults, disappearances, any crime near buildings he had serviced. A chilling pattern emerged. Between 1998 and 2003, a cluster of unsolved apartment intrusions mirrored his known methods. Forced entries without force locks, minimal traces, clean exits. The implication was horrifying. Investigators began contacting families, reopening wounds, asking impossible questions. Was Camille the only victim who died, or merely the only one who left enough evidence to speak from the grave? In his cell, Moreau felt the walls closing in. Interrogations resumed. Again and again. They asked about other addresses, other nights, other screams. At first, he denied everything. Then, slowly, cracks formed. "I don't remember," he whispered. "I don't want to remember." But memory is relentless, and guilt is louder than silence. One evening alone, he finally broke. "There were others," he said. The words floated in the air like smoke. Not like her. Not killed, but scared. He swallowed. "I entered. They woke up. I ran." Marchand remained still. "How many?" His voice trembled. "I don't know." A pause. "Too many." Each confession reopened new investigations. Cold cases stirred. Families received phone calls they never expected. Some found closure. Others discovered new layers of pain. But nothing matched the weight of Camille's story, the single strand of hair that outlived time itself. Months later, as the trial concluded, Marchand stood alone inside the evidence archive. She stared at the empty space where Camille's box had once rested. One file removed. Thousands remained, each one a voice waiting to be heard, each one a ghost pressing against the present. She closed her eyes. Somewhere, another killer was living freely. Another family was waiting. Another tiny fragment of truth lay hidden, waiting for science, persistence, and human will to converge. Because cold cases never truly die. They wait. They breathe. They whisper. And one day, they speak. In a quiet Parisian cemetery, Helene Durand stood before her daughter's grave. She placed fresh white lilies beside the stone. "I found you," she whispered. The wind stirred the trees. Above, clouds drifted across the sky. And for the first time in 20 years, she walked away without looking back. Yet far beyond the city, far beyond France, other evidence rooms lay sealed. Other boxes stacked in silence. Other hairs. Other fingerprints. Other secrets. Waiting. Because the past is patient. And justice, once awakened, never sleeps again. The courtroom was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Every bench was filled. Journalists lined the walls. Cameras waited behind glass. Police officers stood rigid near the exits. Even the air seemed heavy, thick with anticipation, charged with decades of unanswered questions and the unbearable weight of truth finally arriving. At the center of it all sat Laurent Moreau. His hands were folded. His back was straight. His eyes fixed on the floor. For 20 years, he had lived as a free man. Now, every second of his remaining life would be measured by the consequences of a single night. The prosecutor rose slowly. Her voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. On October 17, 2001, at approximately 11:43 p.m., Camille Durand was murdered inside her apartment. The defendant entered unlawfully, encountered the victim, and ended her life to avoid identification. She paused. For 2 decades, this crime remained a cold case. A wound left open. A silence imposed upon a grieving family. Her gaze hardened, until science shattered that silence. Screens flickered to life behind her. Photographs of the crime scene appeared. Then the evidence archive. Then the DNA sequencing process. Then the genealogical family tree, branching outward like a living organism, tracing bloodlines across generations, narrowing time and space until only one man remained. The prosecutor turned toward Moreau. The smallest fragment, a single strand of hair, outlived your lies. A murmur rippled through the room. She continued. You erased fingerprints. You cleaned surfaces. You burned clothes. But you forgot one thing. She pointed to the screen. Your biology. The forensic experts testified. They explained the probability statistics. 1 in 7.8 trillion. Beyond any rational doubt. Then came the psychologists. They described opportunistic violence. The sudden shift from theft to murder. The psychology of fear, panic, and survival instinct overriding morality. They spoke of the mind of a man who did not plan to kill, but who chose to do so when confronted. Finally, Detective Marchand took the stand. Her voice was steady. Her words precise. She walked the jury through every step. The reopening of the file. The forgotten hair. The laboratory breakthrough. The genealogical hunt. The cafe cup. The DNA match. And the confession. When she finished, the courtroom remained frozen. No applause. No movement. Only gravity. Moreau's defense attorney rose. His voice was softer. Measured. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, my client lived for 20 years without committing another violent crime. He worked, paid taxes, had neighbors, friends. He hesitated. He is not a monster. He is a man who made a terrible choice in a moment of terror. A murmur spread again. He did not intend to kill. He panicked. He lost control. He turned toward Moreau. And he has confessed. His voice cracked slightly. He is sorry. Camille's mother rose without warning. The judge hesitated, then nodded. She stepped forward, hands trembling. I don't care what he intended, she said quietly. Her voice was fragile and unbreakable. My daughter is dead. She looked straight at Moreau. You took her voice. You took her future. You took every moment she should have lived. Tears slid down her cheeks. And then you went home. You slept. You woke up. You lived. Her breath shook. While I buried my child, silence collapsed over the courtroom. Moreau's shoulders slumped. For the first time, he looked up. Their eyes met. And something inside him broke. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Outside, crowds gathered. Candles burned along the courthouse steps. Photographs of Camille lined the pavement. Handwritten notes lay scattered among the flowers. Justice for Camille. Never forgotten. 20 years too late. Inside the jury room, the weight of the decision pressed down on 12 strangers who now carried the responsibility of history. At 8:17 p.m., they returned. The courtroom rose. The foreman stood. In the matter of the murder of Camille Durand, we find the defendant, Laurent Moreau. A pause. Guilty. A collective exhale swept the room. Moreau closed his eyes. The judge spoke. Life imprisonment. No possibility of parole. The gavel struck. And 20 years of silence finally shattered. But justice did not bring peace. Not immediately. Because closure is not an ending. It is a reckoning. In the days that followed, Paris remained suspended in shock. News programs dissected every detail. Talk shows debated morality. Psychologists discussed guilt. Legal analysts examined the precedent set by genetic genealogy. Across the country, families of cold case victims flooded police stations with calls. Boxes long sealed were reopened. Samples re-examined. Dust blown from forgotten evidence. The system stirred. And with it, long-buried hope. Detective Marchand returned to the archive again. She walked between the endless rows of files, her footsteps echoing softly. Each box held a story. Each label a human life paused in time. She stopped before a shelf marked 1993 to 1997. Dozens of unsolved murders. Disappearances. Assaults. So many ghosts. Camille's case had proven something dangerous. That the past could be resurrected. And once awakened, it would not rest. In his cell, Laurent Moreau faced a different reality. The walls were bare. The light harsh. The silence unbearable. For 20 years, his mind had built barriers. Locked away memory. Smothered guilt. Now, there was nowhere left to hide. Night after night, he replayed it. The scream.
The fall. The stillness.
And each morning, he woke inside the consequences of his own fear. Camille's mother visited her grave often. She spoke to her daughter as if no time had passed. I found you, she whispered again and again. I brought you back. But grief does not vanish. It changes. It becomes quieter, heavier, more permanent. Yet for the first time in 2 decades, she no longer lived inside uncertainty. She knew, and knowing, however painful, was freedom. Across France, policymakers moved quickly. Laws governing genealogical databases were rewritten. Cold case units received funding. New technology was approved. Thousands of samples were reprocessed. The past was no longer allowed to remain silent. But beneath the headlines, beneath the legal reforms, beneath the technology, one question haunted investigators. How many killers believed they were safe? How many men, like Moreau, trusted time to erase their crimes? How many fragments of DNA waited patiently, preserved inside evidence lockers, waiting for science to catch up? The answer was terrifying and exhilarating, because it meant justice had only just begun. Late one night, Marchand stood alone on the Pont Neuf, watching the Seine glide beneath her. Lights shimmered across the water. Paris breathed quietly. She thought of Camille, of her mother, of every cold case that still waited. And she understood something fundamental. Crimes do not disappear. They sink. They wait. They endure. And one day, they rise. Another strand of hair discovered. Another family awakened by a phone call that would change everything. Because silence is not safety. And time is not mercy. And the past never forgets. Long after the courtroom emptied, long after the cameras shut down and the crowds dissolved into the Parisian night, the city remained awake. Something invisible had shifted. For 20 years, the murder of Camille Durand had existed as a shadow, a rumor whispered in stairwells, a question left unanswered at family dinners, a name spoken softly in candlelit vigils. Now, that shadow had taken form. It had been dragged into the light, examined, judged, and sealed behind concrete and steel. Yet peace did not follow. Only a deeper, heavier silence. In the days after the verdict, Camille's apartment was opened once more. Dust hung in the air, disturbed for the first time in decades. Pale sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, illuminating faint marks left by long-removed furniture. The walls still bore the subtle imprint of framed photographs, like ghosts of moments once lived. Detective Marchand stood in the doorway, unmoving. She had walked through countless crime scenes. Yet this one felt different. Because here, time had been suspended. The space had not healed. It had simply waited. She stepped inside. Every sound echoed. Her footsteps. Her breath. The distant hum of traffic outside. And for a fleeting moment, she imagined Camille still there, barefoot, half asleep, moving through the darkness, unaware that her life was about to fracture into before and after. Marchand closed her eyes. The past did not ask permission. It returned when it wanted. Across Paris, people began to look at their surroundings differently. Hallways felt longer. Elevators more confined. Unfamiliar footsteps behind them drew sharper attention. The illusion of safety had cracked. Because Laurent Moreau had not been a stranger lurking in shadows. He had been a worker, a technician, a man with keys, access, trust. The revelation unsettled something fundamental. It forced the city to confront a truth both simple and terrifying. Danger does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with a uniform, with a toolbox, with a polite smile. In a quiet suburban home, Camille's mother, Helene, sat alone beside a window. The curtains swayed gently in the breeze. Sunlight painted soft patterns across the floor. For 20 years, she had lived inside waiting. Waiting for news. Waiting for answers. Waiting for justice. Now, that waiting had ended. And in its place was something unfamiliar. Stillness. She folded a letter slowly. A final statement she had written to the court, but never read aloud. In it, she described Camille as a child, stubborn, curious, endlessly compassionate. A girl who collected seashells, who loved stray animals, who once gave her winter coat to a homeless man on the metro. She described birthdays that never came, weddings that never happened, children who were never born. Then she sealed the envelope and placed it inside a drawer. Some words did not need to be heard. Some grief did not need witnesses. In prison, Laurent Moreau entered a different kind of eternity. Days became indistinguishable. Morning, meal, silence, lights out. Time no longer passed. It repeated. His cell was narrow, window high, unreachable. Through it, he could see a fragment of sky. Sometimes blue, sometimes gray, sometimes heavy with rain. Each night, memories returned. Not just of Camille, but of every moment he had stolen from her. Her future, her laughter, her possibilities. He tried to sleep. Sleep refused him, because in darkness, the past grows louder. And remorse is a patient predator. The cold case division expanded. Budgets increased. Technology upgraded. Evidence rooms across France reopened. Thousands of samples were reanalyzed. Old fingerprints digitized. Faded documents scanned. Lost leads rediscovered. Camille's case had ignited a movement, and with it, a dangerous promise that no crime was truly beyond reach, that time did not protect the guilty, and that the smallest trace could one day rewrite history. But hope carried weight, because for every case solved, dozens remained silent. Dozens of families still waited. Dozens of answers still hid in darkness. One evening, Marchand returned to the archive for the last time. She walked slowly between the towering shelves, reading faded labels. Names.
Dates.
Locations. Lives frozen in time. She stopped before a row marked unidentified, 1980 to 1990. So many stories. So many voices. She rested her palm against the cold metal shelf and felt the gravity of it all. Every case solved reopened 10 more questions. Every truth uncovered revealed new layers of uncertainty. Justice was not an ending. It was a pursuit. Endless. Relentless. Necessary. Outside, Paris glimmered. Tourists filled the streets. Music drifted from cafes. Laughter echoed beneath street lamps. Life moved forward, unstoppable. But beneath the rhythm of everyday existence, the echo of Camille's story lingered, a quiet reminder that every ordinary moment is fragile, that safety is temporary, that truth is patient, and that even in the brightest cities, darkness never fully disappears. Months later, a young forensic technician entered the archive for the first time. Fresh uniform, steady hands, bright eyes. She stopped before an unassuming box, brushed the dust from its label, and lifted it gently. Inside, sealed within plastic, lay a single fiber. Nearly invisible. Almost nothing. Yet everything. Because somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the past, another voice waited. And one day it would speak. Camille Durand's story did not end with her killer's conviction. It became a signal, a warning, and a promise that no silence is permanent, that no secret is eternal, and that justice, no matter how delayed, still matters. Because every life deserves truth, and every victim deserves to be heard. In the stillness of early morning, as the first light crept across Paris, the city breathed in. And somewhere, beyond the noise and motion, beyond fear and hope, beyond time itself, the past waited. Watching, remembering, waiting to be discovered.